The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet, and yet we have explored less of its floor than we have the surface of the moon. Beneath those dark, crushing depths lie secrets that could rewrite everything we think we know about the human story. Ancient cities swallowed by rising tides, stone monuments that predate the oldest known civilizations by thousands of years, shipwrecks so perfectly preserved they look as though they sank yesterday, and patterns carved into the seabed that seem impossibly deliberate, impossibly geometric, impossibly old. For generations, we have told the story of human civilization as a slow, steady march from primitive origins to modern complexity, a neat timeline that begins in a handful of cradles and spreads outward across the continents. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the evidence we need to understand our true past is not buried in the earth beneath our feet, but drowned beneath miles of salt water, hidden in the one place we have barely begun to look? Tonight, we descend into the abyss. We travel to volcanic islands in the mid-Atlantic where strange stone walls emerge from the seafloor. We journey to Southeast Asia, where an entire continent vanished beneath the waves at the end of the last ice age. We stand before the ruins of one of the ancient world's greatest marvels, now scattered across the harbor floor of a modern city. We peer at sonar images from the Caribbean that appear to show something that should not exist. We dive into the cold, black waters off the coast of Japan, where terraced stone platforms challenge everything geologists thought they understood. We sink into the lightless depths of a sea so chemically unique that it has preserved wooden ships for over 2,000 years. And we watch in astonishment as creatures of the deep ocean create works of art on the seafloor that rival anything produced by human hands. This is the story of what lies beneath. This is the story of the worlds we lost. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. There is a small archipelago in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, roughly 900 miles from the coast of Portugal, where the westerly winds carry the smell of sulfur and salt across green volcanic ridges that rise dramatically from the sea. The Azores, 9 islands of extraordinary beauty, perched atop the mid-Atlantic ridge, that tectonic seam where the European and North American plates are slowly pulling apart. To most of the world, the Azores are a quiet destination for whale watching, hiking, and the kind of solitude that comes only from being surrounded by 1,000 miles of open ocean in every direction. But to a persistent and passionate community of researchers, historians, and theorists, the Azores are something far more provocative. They are perhaps the last visible remnants of a lost civilization, the last mountaintops of a drowned world, the final trace of Atlantis. The idea is not new. It stretches back centuries to the earliest days of European exploration, when Portuguese navigators first reached these remote islands in the 15th century and found them uninhabited, windswept, and strange. There were no indigenous people, no ruins, no pottery shards or burial mounds or any of the usual signs that human beings had lived there before. And yet, almost immediately, whispers began. Sailors spoke of carved stones found in the soil. Fishermen reported pulling up fragments of worked masonry in their nets. And scholars, reading Plato's famous account of a great island civilization that had sunk beneath the sea 9,000 years before his time, began to wonder whether the Azores might sit directly atop the spot where Atlantis had once stood. Plato's account, written around 360 BCE in 2 dialogues called the Timaeus and the Critias, describes Atlantis as a vast island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which most scholars identify as the Strait of Gibraltar. The Atlanteans, Plato wrote, had built a magnificent civilization of concentric rings of water and land, with great harbors, temples covered in silver and gold, and a powerful military that had conquered much of the Mediterranean world before being defeated by the ancient Athenians. Then, in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, the island sank into the ocean and vanished forever. For over 2,000 years, scholars have debated whether Plato's story was meant as historical fact, philosophical allegory, or some combination of the two. The mainstream academic consensus has long held that Atlantis was a literary invention, a moral fable about the dangers of hubris and the wrath of the gods, not a geographic location waiting to be found. And yet the search has never stopped. Atlantis has been proposed to have existed in dozens of locations around the world, from the coast of Spain to the islands of the Caribbean, from the shores of Antarctica to the plains of North Africa. But no proposed location has captured the imagination quite like the Azores, because no other location sits so perfectly in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, precisely where Plato said a great island once stood. The modern investigation of the Azores as a potential site for Atlantis gained significant momentum in the early 2000s, when a series of discoveries, some accidental, some deliberate, brought international attention to the archipelago. Divers exploring the underwater slopes around the islands began reporting the presence of what appeared to be stone walls, terraces, and other structures at various depths beneath the surface. Some of these features were found in relatively shallow water, just a few dozen feet below the surface, while others were detected at much greater depths using sonar and remote sensing equipment. Photographs and video footage circulated online, showing what looked like deliberately cut and stacked stone blocks arranged in linear patterns that seemed too regular to be natural. The excitement was palpable. Here at last was physical evidence that something or someone had existed in the Azores long before the Portuguese arrived. If these structures were genuinely man-made, and if they could be dated to a period before the islands were above water, the implications would be staggering. It would mean that a civilization had existed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean at a time when sea levels were much lower, during or before the last ice age, and that this civilization had been destroyed when the glaciers melted and the oceans rose. It would mean, in short, that Plato might have been right, but the story, as it so often does with claims of this magnitude, became considerably more complicated upon closer examination. Scientific commissions were dispatched to investigate the underwater structures, and their findings were, for the most part, sobering. Many of the so-called walls and terraces turned out to be natural rock formations, the product of volcanic geology in the particular way that basalt, the primary rock type in the Azores, fractures and erodes over time. Basalt has a well-known tendency to cool and crack into angular, columnar shapes that can look remarkably like cut stone blocks, especially when viewed underwater through the distorting lens of a diving mask or a grainy sonar image. The parallel lines that had excited so many researchers were, in the judgment of the geologists, simply the natural jointing patterns of cooled lava flows. Other structures that had been reported as ancient ruins were found, upon investigation, to have distinctly modern origins. Some were the remains of old fishing weirs, stone traps built in shallow coastal waters to catch fish during low tide, a common practice in the Azores for centuries. Others were fragments of harbor infrastructure, breakwaters and jetties that had been built and abandoned during various periods of Portuguese settlement. A few were simply piles of ballast stones dumped overboard by sailing ships that had anchored in the island harbors over the past 500 years. In each case, what had appeared mysterious and ancient from a distance turned out to be mundane and explicable up close. The scientific commissions published their reports, and the academic world largely moved on. For mainstream archaeology and geology, the case was closed. There was no credible evidence of a pre-Portuguese civilization in the Azores, no submerged ruins, no Atlantis. The structures were natural, modern, or both, and the persistent claims to the contrary were the product of wishful thinking, pareidolia, which is the human tendency to see meaningful patterns in random data, and a fundamental misunderstanding of volcanic geology. And yet, the case has never been entirely closed in the minds of many researchers who continue to investigate the Azores. They point out that the scientific commissions examined only a small number of the reported sites, and that many of the most intriguing underwater features have never been properly studied. They note that the Azores sit atop one of the most geologically active regions on Earth, and that the seafloor around the islands has been dramatically reshaped by volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and tectonic movement over the millennia, meaning that any ancient structures that might have existed could have been buried, broken apart, or otherwise obscured beyond easy recognition. They argue that the dismissal of all the underwater features as natural formations is premature, and that a more thorough and open-minded investigation is warranted. Some researchers have also pointed to other evidence that they believe supports the case for an ancient presence in the Azores. There are reports of unusual rock carvings found on several of the islands, petroglyphs and symbols that some researchers believe are too sophisticated to have been produced by natural erosion, and that bear resemblances to ancient writing systems found in other parts of the world. There are legends among the early Portuguese settlers about finding strange artifacts in the soil, including coins and pottery fragments that did not match any known European origin. And there are the islands themselves, their very existence as habitable land in the middle of the Atlantic, which some theorists argue is too geographically significant to have been ignored by ancient seafaring civilizations that were more capable than mainstream history gives them credit for. The debate over the Azores and Atlantis is, in many ways, a microcosm of a much larger debate that runs through the entire field of ancient history and archaeology. On one side stand the mainstream scientists, trained in rigorous methodology, skeptical of extraordinary claims, and insistent that extraordinary evidence is required before extraordinary conclusions can be drawn. On the other side stand the alternative researchers, often passionate amateurs or independent scholars, who believe that mainstream science is too conservative, too dismissive, and too wedded to established narratives to recognize evidence that challenges the conventional timeline of human civilization. Both sides accuse the other of bias. Both sides believe they are defending the truth, and both sides, it must be said, have legitimate points to make. The mainstream scientists are correct that many of the specific claims made about the Azores have not withstood scrutiny, and that the human brain is extraordinarily skilled at seeing patterns and structures where none exist, especially when looking at underwater images through the filter of a pre-existing belief. The alternative researchers are correct that the ocean floor remains largely unexplored, that mainstream archaeology has a long history of dismissing claims that later turned out to be true, and that the end of the last ice age saw sea levels rise by over 400 feet, submerging an area of formerly dry land roughly equal in size to the continent of Africa. If ancient civilizations existed on those now drowned coastlines and lowlands, their remains would be underwater, and we would have almost no way of knowing about them with our current level of deep-sea exploration. The truth, as is so often the case, likely lies somewhere in the vast and murky space between certainty and speculation. The Azores may not be Atlantis. The underwater structures around the islands may indeed be natural formations and modern debris. But the questions that the Azores raise about what might lie beneath the ocean's surface, about how much of the human past has been lost to rising seas, about whether our understanding of ancient history is complete, those questions are real and they are important and they deserve to be asked. The story of the Azores is, in the end, not really about Atlantis. It is about the limits of human knowledge. It is about the vast, dark, unexplored frontier that begins at the waterline and extends downward for miles. And it is about the tantalizing possibility that the most important chapters of our story may be the ones we have not yet read, because they are written in stone at the bottom of the sea. To understand why the idea of lost civilizations beneath the ocean is not merely the stuff of fantasy and speculation, one must first understand the extraordinary geological transformation that reshaped the surface of the Earth at the end of the last ice age. It is a story of such magnitude, such sweeping planetary change, that it is difficult for the human mind to fully grasp, and yet it is one of the most thoroughly documented and well understood events in the history of our planet. Between approximately 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, the Earth was locked in the grip of what geologists call the last glacial maximum. Enormous ice sheets, some more than 2 miles thick, covered much of the northern hemisphere. The Laurentide ice sheet buried most of what is now northern North America under a frozen mantle of unimaginable weight. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covered northern Europe. The Cordilleran ice sheet smothered the western mountains. Together, these vast glaciers contained so much of the Earth's water, locked up as ice, that global sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. 400 feet. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment, because it is the key that unlocks everything that follows. When sea levels are 400 feet lower than they are today, the world looks radically different. Coastlines extend outward for tens, sometimes hundreds of miles. Islands that are today separated by deep channels become connected to the mainland by wide land bridges. Shallow seas disappear entirely, revealing vast plains of dry, habitable land. The English Channel does not exist. The islands of Indonesia are connected to the Asian mainland by a continuous landmass. Australia is joined to New Guinea. Alaska is connected to Siberia. And everywhere the continental shelves, those gently sloping underwater platforms that ring every continent, are exposed to the sun and the rain and the wind, forming some of the most fertile, resource-rich, and hospitable landscapes on the planet. It is a profound and often overlooked fact that the continental shelves, now submerged beneath shallow seas, would have been among the most attractive places for ancient human populations to live. They were flat, well-watered, close to the ocean's abundant food resources, and protected from the harsh conditions that prevailed further inland during the Ice Age. If early humans were anything like modern humans in their preference for coastal living, and all evidence suggests they were, then the continental shelves would have been prime real estate during the Ice Age, home to potentially millions of people over thousands of years. And then the ice melted. Beginning around 19,000 years ago and continuing in fits and starts for the next 12,000 years, the great glaciers began to retreat. The process was not smooth or gradual. It occurred in a series of dramatic pulses, periods of rapid warming and catastrophic flooding that are recorded in the geological record as meltwater pulses. During the most extreme of these events, meltwater pulse 1A, which occurred approximately 14,600 years ago, sea levels rose by as much as 65 feet in just a few centuries, a rate of rise so rapid that it would have been noticeable within a single human lifetime. Imagine standing on a beach and watching the ocean advance toward you, year after year, decade after decade, swallowing fields and forests and settlements that had existed for generations. Imagine the stories that would have been told about such an event. Imagine the myths that would have been born. By the time the process was complete, around 7,000 years ago, the world's oceans had risen to approximately their current levels, and an area of land roughly 14 million square miles, an area larger than the combined landmasses of Europe and South America, had been swallowed by the sea. Every coastline on Earth had been redrawn. Every coastal community, every fishing village, every harbor settlement that had existed during the Ice Age was now underwater. And with them presumably went any evidence of the people who had lived there, their tools, their buildings, their art, their stories. All of it drowned, buried beneath sand and silt and the cold, dark weight of the ocean. This is the context in which the search for lost civilizations must be understood. It is not a question of whether large areas of habitable land were submerged at the end of the Ice Age. They were. That is established science, documented by thousands of studies, confirmed by sea level records, sediment cores, coral reef data, and satellite imagery. The only question is whether anyone was living on those lands when they went under, and if so, what kind of societies they had built. Mainstream archaeology has traditionally answered this question with a qualified shrug. Yes, people were living on the now submerged continental shelves during the Ice Age. Yes, some of those areas were densely populated. But those populations, the standard narrative holds, were hunter-gatherers, small bands of nomadic people who left little in the way of permanent structures, and whose traces would be nearly impossible to find even on dry land, let alone beneath the ocean. The first true civilizations, with their monumental architecture, written records, organized agriculture, and complex social hierarchies, did not appear until around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China. Everything before that was prehistory, a long, slow prelude to the main event, but there are places on Earth where this neat timeline begins to fray at the edges. Places where the evidence suggests that human activity during the Ice Age and its immediate aftermath may have been far more complex, far more organized, and far more widespread than the conventional narrative allows. And one of the most compelling of these places is a vast, drowned landmass in Southeast Asia that geologists call Sundaland. Sundaland is a name that most people have never heard, and yet it refers to one of the largest and most significant landmasses that has ever existed on our planet. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were at their lowest, the shallow seas that today separate the islands of Southeast Asia, the Java Sea, the South China Sea, the Gulf of Thailand, did not exist. In their place was a continuous expanse of dry land that connected the modern islands of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula into a single, enormous continent, a landmass roughly the size of Europe that stretched from the tropics nearly to the equator. This was Sundaland, and by any measure, it was one of the most biologically rich and ecologically diverse landscapes on Earth. The evidence for Sundaland's existence comes from multiple independent lines of scientific inquiry. Bathymetric surveys of the seafloor in Southeast Asia reveal that the seabed in this region is remarkably shallow, in many places less than 150 feet deep, exactly what one would expect if these areas had been dry land during the low sea levels of the Ice Age. Sediment cores extracted from the seafloor contain layers of terrestrial soil, peat, and freshwater deposits, clear evidence that these areas were once above water and supported rivers, lakes, and forests. And geological mapping of the submerged river systems, the ancient drainage networks that once carried water across the Sundaland surface, reveals an intricate pattern of river valleys, deltas, and floodplains that are now invisible beneath the waves, but that can be traced using sonar and satellite data. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for the significance of Sundaland comes not from geology, but from paleontology and anthropology. Over the past century, researchers working across Southeast Asia have recovered more than 6,000 fossil fragments from sites that were once part of the Sundaland landmass. These fossils paint a picture of an extraordinarily rich and diverse ecosystem, home to elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, orangutans, and a dazzling array of other species. And among those fossils are the remains of our own ancestors. The most remarkable of these finds are the Homo erectus remains discovered at several sites across Java, fossils that date back as far as 140,000 years. Homo erectus, our direct ancestor or close evolutionary cousin, depending on which paleoanthropologist you ask, was a highly successful species that had spread out of Africa and across much of Asia by approximately 1.5 million years ago. The Javan fossils represent some of the youngest known Homo erectus populations, individuals who were living on the Sundaland landmass tens of thousands of years after the species had disappeared from most of the rest of the world. The implications are profound. Sundaland was not merely a piece of dry land that happened to exist during the Ice Age. It was a critical hub for early human migration and evolution, a crossroads where different human species and populations interacted, adapted, and thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. The tropical climate, the abundant food resources, the navigable rivers, the sheltered coastlines, all of these would have made Sundaland an ideal environment for human habitation. And given the enormous timescales involved, stretching back over 100,000 years, the sheer volume of human activity that took place on this now vanished landscape is almost impossible to calculate. Consider what this means. For at least 100,000 years, and probably much longer, human beings were living, breeding, developing tools and techniques, and building communities on a vast tropical continent that no longer exists. The forests of Sundaland sheltered some of the most important chapters in the human story, chapters that played out over geological timescales, across a landscape of extraordinary beauty and abundance. Rivers larger than the modern Mekong or the Ganges carved their way through dense tropical forests, emptying into broad deltas that would have been teeming with fish, birds, and other wildlife. The coastlines, which during the Ice Age extended far beyond their current positions, would have offered sheltered harbors, productive fisheries, and easy routes for travel and trade. And then, beginning around 19,000 years ago, the waters began to rise. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the seas crept inward across the flat, low-lying Sundaland plain. Rivers swelled, coastal settlements were abandoned. Entire ecosystems were disrupted and destroyed as saltwater invaded freshwater habitats. Over the course of several thousand years, the vast Sundaland continent was progressively dismembered, broken apart into the scattered archipelago of islands that we see today. The islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, separated by warm, shallow seas that conceal the drowned landscape beneath. The human populations of Sundaland did not simply disappear. They adapted, they moved. They climbed to higher ground as the waters rose, retreating to the mountainous interiors of the emerging islands, or taking to boats and spreading outward across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Many researchers believe that the drowning of Sundaland was one of the primary drivers of the Great Austronesian Expansion, the remarkable maritime migration that eventually carried human settlers to every habitable island in the Pacific, from New Zealand to Hawaii to Easter Island, creating a web of seafaring cultures that spanned a third of the globe. But what did those populations leave behind on the land that is now underwater? This is the question that haunts researchers who study Sundaland, because the answer is, we do not know. Almost no underwater archaeological work has been conducted on the submerged Sundaland shelf. The area is vast, the waters are murky, the currents are treacherous, and the political and logistical challenges of conducting deep-sea research in the territorial waters of multiple nations are enormous. What we have are fossils and artifacts recovered from above-water sites on the modern islands, tantalizing fragments that hint at the richness of what might lie beneath the sea, but that cannot tell us the full story, and the fragments are tantalizing indeed. In addition to the Homo erectus fossils, researchers have found evidence of remarkably sophisticated behavior among the ancient inhabitants of the Sundaland region. Stone tools of increasing complexity appear in the archaeological record over time, suggesting a progressive development of technology and cognitive ability. There is evidence of early seafaring, dating back at least 65,000 years, when modern humans first crossed the water gaps that separated Sundaland from the Australian landmass, a journey that required deliberate ocean navigation, even during periods of low sea level. There are cave paintings in Borneo that date back at least 40,000 years, making them among the oldest known examples of figurative art anywhere in the world. And there is the sheer biological diversity of the region, the extraordinary richness of the tropical ecosystem that supported these populations, an ecosystem that would have provided more than enough resources to support large, stable communities. Some researchers have gone further, arguing that the conditions on Sundaland may have been favorable for the development of early agriculture, possibly preceding the traditionally recognized origins of farming in the Fertile Crescent by thousands of years. The tropical environment of Sundaland would have offered a wide variety of edible plants, including the ancestors of rice, taro, yam, and banana, all of which are believed to have been first domesticated in Southeast Asia. If early Sundaland populations began experimenting with the cultivation of these crops during the late Ice Age, the evidence of those experiments would now be underwater, invisible to conventional archaeology. This is the crux of the Sundaland mystery. We know that this landmass existed. We know that it was inhabited by human beings for at least 100,000 years. We know that the populations living there were cognitively modern, technologically capable, and culturally sophisticated. We know that the landscape was extraordinarily rich in resources, and we know that the vast majority of this landscape, including all of its lowland coastal areas, is now submerged beneath the sea. The question of what might be down there, what settlements, what artifacts, what traces of a long and complex human history, is one of the most important unanswered questions in all of archaeology. The scientific community's response to this question has been mixed. Many archaeologists acknowledge the theoretical importance of submerged landscapes like Sundaland, but point out the enormous practical difficulties of conducting underwater research in the region. The waters are warm but murky, with visibility often measured in inches rather than feet. The seafloor is covered in thick layers of sediment that would need to be carefully excavated. The area to be searched is measured in hundreds of thousands of square miles. And the funding for such work is minimal, because the uncertain prospect of finding anything significant is a hard sell to the government agencies and academic institutions that control research budgets. Other researchers, particularly those working in the field of marine archaeology, are more optimistic. They point to the rapid advances in underwater exploration technology, including autonomous underwater vehicles, high-resolution sonar mapping, and remote sensing techniques, that are making it increasingly feasible to survey large areas of the seafloor in detail. They note that similar submerged landscape research has already yielded significant results in other parts of the world, including the North Sea, where the drowned Ice Age landscape known as Doggerland has been extensively mapped and studied, revealing a complex prehistoric world of rivers, hills, and coastal settlements that existed before the area was flooded around 8,000 years ago. If similar work were conducted on the Sundaland shelf, the results could be revolutionary. Even the discovery of a single submerged settlement, a collection of post holes or stone foundations or shell middens preserved beneath the marine sediment, would be enough to fundamentally alter our understanding of the human past in Southeast Asia. And if more substantial remains were found, structures or artifacts suggesting a level of social organization beyond what is typically attributed to Ice Age populations, the implications would ripple outward through every branch of the historical and archaeological sciences. For now, Sundaland remains one of the great blank spaces on the map of human history, a vast, drowned world, rich in potential but almost entirely unexplored. A landscape that was home to our ancestors for 100 millennia, that shaped the course of human evolution and migration in ways we are only beginning to understand, and that now lies silent and hidden beneath the warm, shallow seas of Southeast Asia, waiting for someone to come looking. From the drowned landscapes of Southeast Asia, we turn now to a very different kind of underwater mystery, one that involves not a lost continent but a lost wonder of the ancient world. A structure so famous, so celebrated, so deeply embedded in the cultural memory of Western civilization that its name has become synonymous with guidance, with illumination, with the very idea of a beacon shining across dark and dangerous waters. We are speaking, of course, of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, the last of the 7 wonders of the ancient world to be destroyed, and one of the most ambitious structures ever built by human hands. The story of the Pharos begins in the decades following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, when his vast empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy I, a shrewd and capable ruler who established a dynasty that would govern the Nile kingdom for nearly 3 centuries. Ptolemy chose as his capital the city of Alexandria, which Alexander himself had founded on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt in 331 BCE. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria would grow into the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the ancient world, a center of learning, commerce, and culture that rivaled, and in many ways surpassed, Athens and Rome. But Alexandria had a problem. Its harbor, though spacious and well-positioned for trade, was notoriously difficult to navigate. The approach from the sea was treacherous, marked by shallow reefs, shifting sandbars, and a flat, featureless coastline that offered few landmarks for sailors trying to find the harbor entrance. Ships that missed the narrow channel risked running aground or being dashed against the rocks. And in an age before modern navigational instruments, when sailors depended on visual landmarks to guide them into port, the flat coast of Egypt was a death trap. The solution was the Pharos, a lighthouse of unprecedented size and ambition, built on a small island at the entrance to Alexandria's harbor and designed to be visible from far out at sea. Construction began around 280 BCE under Ptolemy I, though the lighthouse was completed during the reign of his son, Ptolemy II. The architect, according to ancient sources, was a man named Sostratus of Cnidus, and his creation was nothing short of extraordinary. The ancient accounts describe a structure of 3 tiers. The lowest tier was a massive square base, rising approximately 200 feet above the island. Above this sat an octagonal middle section, perhaps another 100 feet tall. And crowning the structure was a cylindrical upper section topped by a great fire that served as the lighthouse's beacon, visible, according to some accounts, from over 30 miles away. At the very top stood a statue, possibly of Zeus or Poseidon, that surveyed the harbor and the sea beyond. The total height of the Pharos is estimated to have been somewhere between 350 and 450 feet, making it one of the tallest man-made structures in the ancient world, surpassed only by the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built primarily of limestone blocks, held together with lead mortar that could withstand the corrosive effects of salt spray and sea wind. The interior contained a ramp or staircase, possibly wide enough for horses or donkeys to carry fuel to the fire at the top. And the fire itself may have been amplified by some kind of reflective surface, perhaps a polished bronze mirror, that concentrated the light and projected it outward across the water. For over 1,000 years, the Pharos stood as a working lighthouse, guiding ships safely into one of the busiest harbors in the world. It survived the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Roman conquest of Egypt, and the rise of Christianity. It was damaged by earthquakes on multiple occasions and repaired each time. Arab travelers who visited Alexandria during the medieval period described the lighthouse in detailed accounts that confirm many of the features mentioned by earlier Greek and Roman writers. But the earthquakes continued, and each one took a greater toll on the aging structure. End came gradually, in a series of catastrophic earthquakes that struck the region between the 10th and 14th centuries CE. The first major quake in 956 CE toppled the statue from the summit and cracked the upper sections of the tower. A second quake in 1303 CE and another in 1323 CE brought down much of the remaining structure. By the end of the 14th century, the Pharos was nothing more than a crumbling ruin on the island of Pharos. In 1480, the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay built a fortress on the site, using many of the lighthouse's fallen stone blocks as building material. The Pharos was gone, and for 500 years it existed only in the pages of ancient texts and the imaginations of historians. Then in the 1990s, the lighthouse was found again, not on land but in the sea. A team of French underwater archaeologists, led by a man named Jean-Yves Empereur, began conducting systematic surveys of the harbor floor off the coast of modern Alexandria, in the waters surrounding the fortress of Qaitbay. What they found was astonishing. Scattered across the seabed, half buried in sand and colonized by marine organisms, were thousands of stone blocks, columns, statues, and architectural fragments. Many of these pieces were enormous, weighing tens of tons, and they bore the unmistakable marks of careful quarrying and skilled masonry work. Some of the blocks matched the descriptions of the Pharos given in ancient texts. Others appeared to come from even older structures, temples and monuments from the Pharaonic period that had been incorporated into the lighthouse's foundation or toppled into the sea during the earthquakes that had destroyed it. Among the most spectacular finds were several colossal statues, including representations of Ptolemaic kings and queens, sphinxes, and other figures from Egyptian and Greek mythology. These statues had been knocked from their pedestals by the earthquakes and had tumbled into the harbor, where they had lain undisturbed for centuries, gradually being covered by sand and encrusted with barnacles and coral. When divers carefully cleaned the surfaces of these figures, they found them remarkably well preserved, their features still sharp and recognizable after 2,000 years of immersion. The harbor floor of Alexandria turned out to be one of the richest underwater archaeological sites in the world. In addition to the remains of the Pharos, the seabed contained fragments of the ancient royal quarter of the Ptolemaic city, which had subsided into the sea as a result of earthquakes and the gradual sinking of the coastline over the centuries. Columns, paving stones, harbor walls, and architectural elements from palaces and temples lay jumbled together on the seabed, creating an underwater jigsaw puzzle of extraordinary complexity. The challenge of studying and preserving this material was enormous. Unlike terrestrial archaeological sites, where artifacts can be carefully excavated, catalogued, and removed to museums, underwater sites present a unique set of problems. Artifacts that have been stable on the seabed for centuries can deteriorate rapidly when exposed to air. The process of raising heavy stone objects from the seafloor is expensive, dangerous, and risks damaging the objects themselves. And the sheer volume of material on the Alexandria harbor floor, estimated at over 3,000 individual pieces, made traditional recovery and conservation impractical. This is where the Pharos project enters the story. Conceived as a response to the challenges of studying and preserving the underwater remains of the lighthouse and its associated structures, the Pharos project represents one of the most ambitious applications of modern technology to ancient archaeology. The core idea is deceptively simple. Rather than raising the lighthouse from the sea, bring the sea to the world. Using advanced three-dimensional scanning technology, the project aims to create a comprehensive digital model of every significant artifact on the Alexandria harbor floor. Teams of divers equipped with photogrammetry cameras and structured light scanners descend to the seabed and methodically photograph each object from hundreds of different angles. These photographs are then processed by powerful software algorithms that stitch them together into detailed three-dimensional models, accurate to within a fraction of a millimeter. The resulting digital models capture not just the shape and dimensions of each artifact, but also its surface texture, its color, and the patterns of wear, damage, and marine incrustation that tell the story of its time beneath the sea. The individual artifact models are then assembled into a larger digital reconstruction of the harbor floor, creating what researchers call a digital twin of the underwater site. This digital twin allows archaeologists to study the spatial relationships between different objects, to test hypotheses about how the lighthouse was constructed and how it collapsed, and to virtually reassemble the scattered blocks and fragments into a coherent picture of the original structure. For the first time in over 500 years, it becomes possible to see the Pharos of Alexandria, not as a ruin on the seabed or a description in an ancient text, but as a three-dimensional structure that can be examined from every angle, walked through virtually, and studied in detail that would be impossible to achieve through diving alone. The technology behind the Pharos project is part of a broader revolution in the field of digital heritage, a rapidly growing discipline that uses cutting-edge technology to record, preserve, and share the world's cultural heritage. Three-dimensional scanning and photogrammetry have been used to create digital models of everything from individual artifacts to entire archaeological sites, from the caves of Lascaux to the temples of Angkor Wat. But the application of these techniques to underwater archaeology is particularly exciting because it addresses one of the field's most fundamental challenges, the difficulty of making submerged sites accessible to researchers and the public. An underwater archaeological site, no matter how spectacular, is by its nature inaccessible to most people. Only trained divers can visit it, and even they can spend only limited time at depth, constrained by the physics of human physiology and the hazards of the marine environment. Photographs and video footage can convey some sense of the site, but they are inherently two-dimensional and cannot capture the spatial relationships and architectural details that are essential for understanding a complex structure like the Pharos. A digital twin, by contrast, can be explored by anyone with a computer or a virtual reality headset from any angle, at any scale, for as long as they wish. It democratizes access to the past in a way that was previously impossible. The Pharos project is also contributing to the ongoing debate about how the lighthouse was actually designed and constructed. For centuries, scholars have relied on the descriptions of ancient writers, most of whom were not engineers and whose accounts often disagree on important details. The digital reconstruction allows engineers and architects to test different interpretations against the physical evidence on the seabed. How were the stone blocks quarried and transported? How were they stacked and secured? What was the internal structure of the tower? How was fuel carried to the fire at the top? What kind of reflective system was used to amplify the light? These questions, which have been the subject of speculation and debate for generations, can now be addressed with a level of empirical rigor that was previously impossible. The recovered stone blocks themselves are objects of fascination. Many of them bear inscriptions, carved in Greek, that provide information about the construction and maintenance of the lighthouse. Others show tool marks and quarry markings that offer clues about the techniques used to cut and shape the stone. Some blocks have been found with lead-pore channels, grooves cut into the stone to receive molten lead that would be used to secure metal clamps holding the blocks together. This lead mortar construction technique was a hallmark of high-quality ancient engineering, designed to provide flexibility and resilience in a structure that would be subjected to the constant forces of wind, waves, and seismic activity. The harbor floor of Alexandria has also yielded artifacts that predate the lighthouse by centuries. Among the most remarkable are several granite obelisks and statue fragments that appear to date from the Pharaonic period, possibly as early as the reign of Ramesses II, over 1,200 years before the Pharos was built. These older artifacts were apparently incorporated into the lighthouse's foundation, reused by the Ptolemaic builders as readily available building material, a common practice in the ancient world. The presence of these pharaonic fragments among the lighthouse remains adds another layer of historical complexity to the site and raises intriguing questions about the continuity of sacred and monumental architecture on the island of Pharos across the millennia. As the Pharos project continues its work, new discoveries are being made on a regular basis. Each dive to the harbor floor reveals additional artifacts, additional blocks, additional fragments of the ancient wonder. The digital model grows more detailed and more complete with each passing season. And with each new piece of the puzzle, the Pharos comes a little more into focus, emerging from the depths not as a myth or a legend, but as a real physical structure, built by real people using real engineering techniques, a testament to the ambition and ingenuity of the ancient world. There is something deeply moving about this process. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was built to guide sailors safely home, to shine a light across dark and dangerous waters, to be a fixed point of reference in a world of shifting currents and treacherous shoals. For over 1,000 years it fulfilled that purpose. Then it fell, and for 500 more years it lay forgotten at the bottom of the sea, its light extinguished, its stones scattered, its name remembered only in books. Now, through the patient, painstaking work of archaeologists and technologists, the Pharos is being brought back to life, not as a physical structure of stone and fire, but as a digital structure of data and light, visible once again to anyone who wishes to see it, shining across the centuries. The waters of the world do not give up their secrets easily. Every discovery, every submerged ruin, every artifact pulled from the seafloor represents the culmination of years of effort, thousands of hours of diving, millions of dollars of investment, and the kind of stubborn, obsessive determination that is the hallmark of anyone who has ever tried to find something that the ocean has taken. And yet, for every discovery that has been made, there are 100 more that remain tantalizingly out of reach, glimpsed briefly on a sonar screen or a grainy underwater photograph, then lost again in the vastness of the deep. One of the most enigmatic of these glimpses occurred in the year 2001, in the warm, turquoise waters of the Caribbean, off the western coast of Cuba. A Canadian exploration company called Advanced Digital Communications was conducting a survey of the seabed in cooperation with the Cuban government, using side-scan sonar to map the ocean floor in search of shipwrecks and other objects of interest. The company had been contracted to survey a broad swath of the Cuban shelf, and its sonar-equipped research vessel had been methodically sweeping the seabed for several weeks when the sonar operator noticed something unusual. On the sonar screen, at a depth of approximately 2,000 feet, the operator observed what appeared to be a series of geometric structures on the ocean floor. The images showed what looked like organized stone formations, rectilinear shapes arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate design rather than natural geology. There were what appeared to be platforms, walls, and terraces, spread across an area roughly the size of a small city. Some of the structures seemed to include pyramidal or truncated cone shapes, reminiscent of the step pyramids found at ancient sites throughout Central America. The formations appeared to be made of stone, and they seemed to be arranged in a grid-like pattern that suggested some form of urban planning. The discovery was announced to the public, and the reaction was explosive. Headlines around the world proclaimed the discovery of a lost city beneath the Caribbean, a sunken civilization that might be related to the Maya, the Aztecs, or even the legendary Atlantis. The sonar images were reproduced in newspapers and on websites, and they did indeed look remarkable. The geometric regularity of the shapes, the apparent organization of the structures, the sheer size of the area they covered, All of it suggested something that should not exist at 2,000 feet beneath the surface of the Caribbean Sea. The exploration company, led by a marine engineer named Paulina Zelitsky, announced plans for follow-up investigations. A remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, was sent down to the site to capture video footage of the structures, and the resulting images seemed to confirm the sonar data. The ROV footage showed what appeared to be large, angular stone blocks, some of them stacked or arranged in patterns, resting on a flat, sandy seabed. Some researchers who viewed the footage described what they saw as cut stone, blocks that appeared to have been deliberately shaped and placed by human hands. Zelitsky and her colleagues proposed that the site might be the remains of an ancient city that had been built on dry land during a period of lower sea levels and subsequently submerged by the rising ocean. If this were true, the city would have to be extremely old, far older than any known civilization in the region, because the area of the Cuban shelf where the structures were found had not been above water for at least 50,000 years, and possibly much longer. This timeline placed the hypothetical city well beyond the accepted beginnings of human civilization and into a realm of prehistory where no complex societies are known to have existed. The scientific community's reaction was predictably skeptical. Geologists pointed out that the depth of the site, over 2,000 feet, made it extremely unlikely that the area had been above water at any point during the period of modern human existence. Even during the lowest sea levels of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were only about 400 feet lower than today, far too shallow to have exposed a site at 2,000 feet of depth. For the structures to be man-made, the land they sat on would have had to have been above water at a time so remote that no human civilization, indeed no human species recognizable as our own, had yet existed. The most likely explanation, many geologists argued, was that the structures were natural geological formations. The Caribbean is a region of intense tectonic and volcanic activity, where the complex interactions between the North American, Caribbean, and South American plates have created a seafloor of extraordinary geological complexity. Volcanic eruptions, limestone dissolution, and tectonic folding can all produce structures that appear regular and geometric when viewed through the limited resolution of side-scan sonar. Flat-topped seamounts, terraced lava flows, and eroded limestone platforms can all mimic the appearance of man-made structures, especially when viewed from a distance or through the distorting lens of sonar imagery. Other scientists were more cautious, noting that the sonar images and ROV footage, while intriguing, were not sufficient to definitively identify the structures as either natural or man-made. The resolution of the available data was simply too low to distinguish between natural geology and artificial construction. What was needed, they argued, was a thorough, systematic investigation of the site, including high-resolution sonar mapping, detailed ROV surveys, and ideally the recovery of physical samples that could be subjected to laboratory analysis. Only with this kind of data could the true nature of the structures be determined, but that investigation has never fully materialized. In the years since the initial discovery, a series of logistical, financial, and political obstacles have prevented the kind of comprehensive study that the site demands. The depth of the site makes diving impossible. Only remotely operated vehicles can reach it, and the deployment of such vehicles in deep water is extraordinarily expensive. The political complexities of working in Cuban territorial waters have added additional layers of difficulty. And the scientific establishment, already skeptical of the initial claims, has shown little enthusiasm for investing significant resources in what many regard as a dubious discovery. As a result, the Caribbean Lost City remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of underwater exploration. The sonar images and ROV footage are still debated, analyzed, and reanalyzed by researchers on both sides of the divide. Supporters of the man-made hypothesis point to the regularity of the structures, the apparent presence of right angles and flat surfaces, and the overall organization of the site as evidence that natural geology alone cannot account for what was observed. Skeptics counter that the human eye is easily fooled by low-resolution imagery, that geometric regularity is far more common in natural geology than most people realize, and that the extraordinary depth of the site makes a man-made origin functionally impossible within any accepted framework of human history. The debate is further complicated by the broader cultural context in which it takes place. The Caribbean Lost City discovery occurred at a time of intense public interest in ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and alternative histories. Television shows, books, and websites devoted to these topics had created a huge and enthusiastic audience for claims of submerged cities and drowned empires, and the Cuban discovery fit perfectly into this narrative. The resulting media coverage was extensive and often sensationalized, presenting the discovery in terms that were far more definitive than the available evidence warranted. The sonar images were described as showing pyramids and streets and buildings, language that implied a level of certainty that the data simply could not support. This media environment made it difficult for the discovery to be evaluated on its own merits. Mainstream scientists, wary of being associated with what they perceived as fringe claims, tended to dismiss the discovery without engaging deeply with the evidence. Alternative researchers, eager to validate their theories about lost civilizations, tended to accept the evidence uncritically and to amplify its significance far beyond what was justified. The result was a polarized debate in which neither side was really listening to the other, and in which the fundamental question, what is actually down there on the Cuban seabed, remained unanswered. It is worth pausing to reflect on how remarkable this situation is. In the 21st century, we have the technology to map the surface of Mars in exquisite detail, to photograph galaxies billions of light-years away, and to sequence the genomes of organisms that have been extinct for tens of thousands of years. And yet we cannot determine whether a set of structures on the floor of the Caribbean Sea, structures that were first identified over 2 decades ago, are natural rock formations or the remains of an ancient civilization. The ocean, even in the relatively accessible waters of the Caribbean, remains a frontier of such vast and daunting proportions that our most fundamental questions about it can go unanswered for decades. The Caribbean Lost City is a mystery that may never be solved, at least not with our current level of technology and our current willingness to invest in deep-sea exploration. But it serves as a powerful reminder of how much of our planet remains unexplored, how much of the human past may be hidden beneath the waves, and how much we still have to learn about the world we inhabit. From the Caribbean, we travel now halfway around the world, to the warm, clear waters off the southern coast of Japan, where another set of enigmatic underwater structures has been sparking debate and controversy for nearly half a century. This is the story of the Yonaguni Monument, and it is a story that touches on some of the deepest and most contentious questions in the study of human history. Yonaguni is the westernmost island of Japan, a small, rugged speck of land in the East China Sea, closer to Taiwan than to the Japanese mainland. The island is known for its strong currents, its hammerhead sharks, and its dramatic underwater landscapes which attract scuba divers from around the world. But it is known above all for a single, extraordinary formation on the seabed just offshore, a formation that has become one of the most debated and polarizing features in all of underwater archaeology. The story begins in 1986, when a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring the waters off the southern coast of Yonaguni, looking for new dive sites where he could take tourists to see the hammerhead sharks that congregated in the area during the winter months. Descending to a depth of about 75 feet, Aratake encountered something that stopped him in his tracks. Rising from the sandy seabed was an enormous stone structure, a flat-topped platform with sharply defined edges, right-angled corners, and what appeared to be a series of terraces stepping down from the top like a giant staircase. The structure was massive, roughly 500 feet long and over 100 feet wide, and its surfaces were remarkably clean and regular, far too regular, Aratake thought, to be a natural rock formation. Aratake reported his discovery, and within a few years, the Yonaguni Monument, as it came to be called, had attracted the attention of researchers, journalists, and curious divers from around the world. The first serious scientific investigation of the site was conducted by Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus in Okinawa, who began studying the monument in the early 1990s. Kimura spent years diving on the site, mapping its features and analyzing its geology, and he eventually concluded that the monument was, at least in part, a man-made structure, a megalithic platform that had been carved from the natural bedrock by ancient builders and subsequently submerged by rising sea levels. Kimura's evidence was detailed and wide-ranging. He identified what he believed were tool marks on the surfaces of the stone, grooves and chisel marks that suggested deliberate shaping rather than natural erosion. He pointed to the sharp, right-angled edges of the terraces, which he argued were too precise and too numerous to be explained by natural fracturing. He identified features that he interpreted as steps, walls, pillars, a ceremonial platform, and what he called a road leading away from the main structure. He noted that the overall shape of the monument, a stepped pyramid or ziggurat, was consistent with the monumental architecture found at ancient sites in other parts of East Asia. And he proposed a date for the monument's construction based on the sea level history of the region, suggesting that the site had been above water during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower, and that it had been submerged by the rising ocean approximately 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. If Kimura was right, the implications were staggering. A man-made structure of this size and complexity, dating to 8,000 or 10,000 years before the present, would predate the oldest known monumental architecture in Japan by several thousand years and would challenge the conventional understanding of the capabilities of prehistoric societies in the region. It would suggest that a sophisticated, organized culture existed in the Ryukyu Islands during the late Ice Age, a culture capable of large-scale stone quarrying and architectural construction at a time when most of the world's population is believed to have consisted of small bands of hunter-gatherers. But not everyone was convinced. The most vocal critic of Kimura's hypothesis was Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, who visited the site in the late 1990s and came to a very different conclusion. Schoch acknowledged that the monument was visually striking and that its terraced appearance was unusual, but he argued that the features Kimura had identified as evidence of human construction could be more parsimoniously explained by natural geological processes. The rock at Yonaguni, Schoch pointed out, is a type of sandstone that is heavily bedded and jointed, meaning that it naturally fractures along flat parallel planes, creating the appearance of steps, terraces, and right-angled corners. This type of fracturing is common in horizontally bedded sedimentary rocks around the world and does not require any human intervention to produce. The sharp edges and flat surfaces that Kimura had attributed to tool marks were, in Schoch's view, simply the result of the stone's natural tendency to break along its bedding planes and joint sets. The road, the pillars, the ceremonial platform, all of these could be explained as natural features of a fractured, eroded sandstone outcrop. Schoch also noted that many of the features Kimura had identified as tool marks were consistent with the abrasive action of ocean currents and the biological boring of marine organisms, both of which are powerful agents of erosion in a high-energy marine environment like the waters around Yonaguni. The strong currents in the area, which can reach speeds of several knots, would have been more than sufficient to scour the stone surfaces smooth and to remove loose material from the joints and fractures, giving the formation its unusually clean and geometric appearance. The debate between Kimura and Schoch became one of the most famous scientific controversies in the field of underwater archaeology, and it has never been definitively resolved. Each side has marshaled detailed arguments and evidence in support of its position, and each side has its passionate adherents. Kimura continued to study the site for decades, publishing papers and books arguing for a human origin. Schoch maintained his position that the monument is a natural formation, while acknowledging its unusual and striking appearance. Other researchers have weighed in on both sides, and the debate has become a standard case study in discussions about the difficulties of distinguishing natural from artificial features in underwater environments. Some researchers have proposed a middle ground, suggesting that the Yonaguni Monument may be a natural rock formation that was subsequently modified by humans, a partially natural, partially man-made structure that combines the products of geology and human activity. This kind of hybrid site is not without precedent in archaeology. Many ancient cultures around the world used natural rock formations as the starting point for their constructions, carving steps, platforms, and other features into existing outcrops rather than building entirely from scratch. If this was the case at Yonaguni, it might explain why the monument has features that seem both natural and artificial, why some surfaces appear to be shaped by tools while others seem to be products of erosion, and why the overall form of the structure is both regular enough to look man-made and irregular enough to look natural. The difficulty, of course, is proving it. Distinguishing between natural erosion and human modification on underwater stone surfaces is extraordinarily challenging, even with the most advanced analytical techniques. Tool marks can be mimicked by biological boring, right angles can be produced by natural fracturing, flat surfaces can be created by current erosion, and the constant marine environment subjects every surface to ongoing modification that gradually obscures any original features, whether natural or artificial. Despite the unresolved scientific debate, the Yonaguni Monument has become one of the most famous dive sites in the world, attracting thousands of visitors each year who come to see the enigmatic formation for themselves. Swimming along the terraces, running a hand across the smooth stone surfaces, peering into the dark crevices between the blocks, it is impossible not to feel a sense of wonder and mystery. Whether the monument was carved by ancient hands or sculpted by the patient work of waves and currents over millennia, it is an extraordinary sight, a reminder that the natural world is capable of producing forms of stunning beauty and geometric precision, and that the line between the natural and the artificial is not always as clear as we might like it to be. The Yonaguni Monument is also a reminder of the enormous challenges that face anyone trying to study the deep past of the ocean floor. Even in the relatively shallow, clear waters of southern Japan, where the monument lies at a depth accessible to recreational divers, the scientific investigation of the site has been hampered by the difficulties of working underwater, the costs of mounting repeated diving expeditions, and the lack of consensus within the scientific community about how to interpret the evidence. If these challenges exist at a well-known, easily accessible site like Yonaguni, imagine how much more daunting they become in deeper, more remote, and less accessible parts of the world's oceans. The mysteries of the deep sea are not confined to stone structures and submerged landscapes. Some of the most remarkable discoveries in underwater archaeology have involved not monumental ruins but humble, everyday objects, the tools, vessels, and vehicles of ordinary life that were lost to the sea through accident, warfare, or natural disaster, and that have been preserved on the ocean floor in conditions of extraordinary fidelity. Nowhere is this more dramatically illustrated than in the Black Sea, that vast, landlocked body of water that lies between Europe and Asia, where a unique combination of chemistry and geography has created what may be the most extraordinary underwater museum on the planet. The Black Sea is, in many ways, one of the most unusual bodies of water on Earth. It is connected to the global ocean only through the narrow straits of the Bosporus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Dardanelles, a constricted passageway that limits the exchange of water between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. This limited connection has a profound effect on the chemistry of the Black Sea's waters, an effect that has turned its depths into one of the most hostile and most preservative environments in the world. The key is oxygen, or rather, the lack of it. In most of the world's oceans, the water column is oxygenated from top to bottom, thanks to the circulation of currents that bring oxygen-rich surface water down to the depths. But in the Black Sea, the limited exchange with the Mediterranean means that the deeper waters receive very little oxygen. Below a depth of approximately 500 feet, the Black Sea becomes anoxic, meaning that its waters contain little to no dissolved oxygen. Instead, the deep waters are saturated with hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas produced by anaerobic bacteria that thrive in the oxygen-free environment. This anoxic zone, which encompasses the vast majority of the Black Sea's volume, is a dead zone for most forms of marine life. Fish, invertebrates, and other aerobic organisms cannot survive in it. But the absence of oxygen has a remarkable side effect. It also prevents the biological processes that normally break down organic material on the seafloor. In oxygenated water, wood, rope, fabric, and other organic materials are rapidly consumed by bacteria, fungi, and marine organisms, a process that can destroy a wooden shipwreck in a matter of decades. But in the anoxic depths of the Black Sea, these materials can survive for centuries, even millennia, in a state of preservation that is virtually unparalleled anywhere else in the world. It was this extraordinary preservative environment that drew a team of researchers to the Black Sea in the early 2000s, on an expedition that would produce some of the most remarkable underwater discoveries of the modern era. The expedition, known as the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project, was a collaboration between several international research institutions, and it used state-of-the-art remotely operated vehicles to survey the deep waters of the Black Sea, mapping the seabed and searching for evidence of shipwrecks and other submerged remains. What they found exceeded all expectations. Over the course of several years, the project identified and documented more than 40 shipwrecks scattered across the deep floor of the Black Sea. The wrecks spanned a period of over 2,000 years, from the Byzantine era back to the ancient Greek and Roman periods. Some of the vessels were merchant ships, heavy-hulled cargo carriers that had been transporting grain, wine, olive oil, and other goods across the Black Sea trade routes. Others were warships, sleek, oar-driven galleys that had patrolled the waters in the service of empires long since fallen. A few appeared to be fishing boats or coastal traders, small, humble vessels that had met their end in sudden storms or navigational errors. But what made the discoveries truly extraordinary was not the number of wrecks or the variety of vessel types. It was their condition. Thanks to the anoxic environment, many of the shipwrecks were preserved in a state of almost unbelievable completeness. Wooden hulls that would have rotted away centuries ago in normal seawater were still intact, their planks and frames still holding their original shape. Masts still stood upright, rigging and rope were still attached. On some vessels, the cargo was still in place, amphorae and storage jars neatly stacked in the hold just as they had been loaded by the crew. On one wreck, the researchers found a wooden steering oar, still in its original position at the stern of the vessel, as though the helmsman had just stepped away. The most remarkable find of all was an ancient Greek trading vessel, dating to approximately 400 BCE, that was found resting upright on the seabed at a depth of over a mile. This ship, believed to be the oldest intact shipwreck ever discovered, was in a state of preservation that left the research team speechless. The hull was complete, the mast was still standing, and the vessel looked almost as though it could be raised to the surface, rigged with sails and sent on its way. Carbon dating confirmed that the ship had been on the bottom of the Black Sea for over 2,400 years, making it a contemporary of the classical Greek world, the age of Socrates, Plato, and the Parthenon. The implications of this discovery for the field of maritime archaeology were profound. Before the Black Sea finds, the study of ancient ships had been based primarily on fragments, scattered timbers and hardware recovered from wrecks in oxygenated waters, where biological degradation had long since destroyed most of the organic material. These fragments provided valuable information about construction techniques and vessel design, but they were inherently incomplete, like trying to reconstruct a building from a handful of bricks. The Black Sea wrecks, by contrast, were complete or nearly complete, offering an unprecedented level of detail about the construction, rigging, and operation of ancient vessels. The research team used their remotely operated vehicles to conduct detailed photographic and video surveys of each wreck, creating three-dimensional models that could be studied by researchers around the world without the need for further diving. The models revealed construction details that had never been observed before in ancient shipbuilding, including the specific techniques used to join the hull planks, the arrangement of internal frames and supports, and the methods used to waterproof the hull. These details filled in gaps in our understanding of ancient maritime technology and provided new insights into the capabilities and limitations of the ships that had carried goods and people across the ancient world. The Black Sea wrecks also provided valuable information about the trade networks and economic systems of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. The cargo found on the merchant vessels, the amphorae, the storage jars, the occasional coin or personal item, told stories of long-distance trade connections, of goods moving from port to port across hundreds or thousands of miles of open water. Chemical analysis of the residues found inside the amphorae revealed the specific commodities that had been traded. Wine, olive oil, fish sauce, grain, and the origins of those commodities could sometimes be traced to specific regions or even specific producers, providing a level of economic detail that is rarely available from terrestrial archaeological sites. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Black Sea discoveries was the human dimension. These were not just ships. They were the workplaces and often the final resting places of real human beings, sailors and merchants and soldiers who had set out across the Black Sea with hopes and plans and destinations, and who had never arrived. The personal items found on some of the wrecks, a cup, a lamp, a pair of sandals, spoke of individual lives lived and lost. The careful stowage of cargo spoke of professional skill and routine, of men who knew their trade and performed it competently, until the moment when storm or accident or structural failure brought their voyage to a sudden and catastrophic end. The Black Sea continues to yield new discoveries. Each expedition to its depths reveals additional wrecks, additional artifacts, additional chapters of the long story of human maritime activity in the region. The anoxic waters, hostile to life but kind to history, have created a time capsule of extraordinary richness, an underwater archive that preserves the material culture of dozens of civilizations across thousands of years. As the technology for deep-sea exploration continues to improve, and as the cost of deploying remotely operated vehicles continues to decline, we can expect the pace of discovery to accelerate, and the story told by the Black Sea's sunken fleet to grow richer and more detailed with each passing year. The Black Sea is a reminder that the ocean is not just a barrier or a void. It is a repository, a vast, dark, cold library of human history, its shelves stocked with the physical evidence of thousands of years of human activity, much of it preserved in conditions that no museum or archive could match. The challenge is learning to read it, developing the technology and the will to access these underwater archives and to extract the stories they contain. It is a challenge that we have only just begun to meet, and the rewards, as the Black Sea discoveries demonstrate, are beyond anything we could have imagined. We have traveled now from the mid-Atlantic to Southeast Asia, from the harbor of Alexandria to the depths of the Caribbean, from the coast of Japan to the floor of the Black Sea. We have seen lost continents, drowned wonders, mysterious stone formations, and perfectly preserved shipwrecks. In each case, the ocean has served as both destroyer and preserver, swallowing the works of human hands and then holding them in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the technology and the curiosity that would eventually allow us to find them again. But the ocean is not merely a passive agent in this story. It is also home to billions of living creatures, many of which are capable of behaviors so complex, so sophisticated, and so visually striking that they have been mistaken, again and again, for the works of human intelligence. In the deep sea, where sunlight never penetrates and the pressures would crush a human body like an aluminum can, there are animals that create structures of astonishing beauty and geometric precision, structures that rival anything produced by the architects and engineers of human civilization. This is one of the most surprising and humbling aspects of the underwater world, the discovery that nature itself is an artist, a builder, a creator of patterns and forms that can fool the most experienced observers into believing they are looking at the products of intelligent design. And nowhere is this more dramatically illustrated than in the behaviors of two remarkable creatures of the deep, the Dumbo octopus and the pufferfish. The Dumbo octopus gets its name from the pair of large, ear-like fins that protrude from the sides of its mantle, giving it a vague resemblance to the Disney elephant character. There are approximately 17 known species of Dumbo octopus, all of them members of the genus Grimpoteuthis, and they are among the deepest living of all octopus species, found at depths ranging from 3,000 to over 13,000 feet. At these extreme depths, the water temperature hovers just a few degrees above freezing, the pressure is measured in tons per square inch, and the darkness is absolute. It is an environment that seems utterly inhospitable to complex life, and yet the Dumbo octopus thrives there, gliding through the lightless water with a graceful, almost dreamlike motion, propelled by gentle undulations of its ear-like fins. What makes the Dumbo octopus relevant to our story is not just its remarkable adaptations to the deep sea environment, though these are impressive in their own right. It is the way that the presence of deep-sea creatures and their traces on the seafloor can complicate the interpretation of underwater discoveries. When researchers are scanning the deep ocean floor with sonar or photographing it with remotely operated vehicles, they sometimes encounter marks, patterns, and formations that appear deliberate and designed. Tracks, depressions, circular patterns, radial symmetries, these features can look startlingly like the traces of intelligent activity, especially to observers who are unfamiliar with the extraordinary diversity and complexity of deep-sea life. Dumbo octopuses, for instance, create distinctive marks on the soft sediment of the deep seafloor as they feed. They typically hover just above the bottom, using their fins to maintain position while they extend their arms to probe the sediment for small crustaceans, worms, and other prey. As they do so, they create radial patterns of arm marks in the sediment, patterns that can persist for weeks or months in the still, currentless waters of the deep ocean. When these marks are observed in sonar images or ROV footage, they can be easily mistaken for something else entirely, the remains of an anchor, a ceremonial circle, or some other artifact of human activity. This is not merely a hypothetical concern. There have been documented cases in which biological traces on the deep seafloor have been initially interpreted as potential artifacts or man-made structures, only to be revealed upon closer inspection as the products of animal behavior. The deep ocean is a world of subtle and surprising marks, and the organisms that live there are capable of modifying their environment in ways that can fool even experienced researchers. But if the Dumbo octopus is an inadvertent deceiver, creating patterns that are sometimes misinterpreted by human observers, the pufferfish is a deliberate artist, creating structures of such breathtaking beauty and mathematical precision that their discovery was one of the most astonishing moments in the history of marine biology. The story begins in the mid-1990s, when divers exploring the sandy seabed near the Japanese island of Amami Oshima, in the Ryukyu archipelago, began noticing strange patterns on the ocean floor. At a depth of about 60 to 80 feet, they found large circular formations in the sand, each one roughly 6 feet in diameter, composed of intricate radial ridges and valleys that emanated outward from a central hub like the spokes of a wheel or the rays of a stylized sun. The patterns were remarkably precise, with each ridge evenly spaced and smoothly contoured, and the overall effect was one of stunning geometric beauty. The formations looked, for all the world, like the products of deliberate design, like crop circles on the ocean floor, and for years no one could explain what was creating them. The mystery deepened as more of the formations were discovered. They appeared in the same general area, on patches of open, sandy seabed, and they were always fresh, as though they had been recently constructed. But there were no obvious candidates for a builder. The formations were too large and too precise to have been created by wave action or currents. They were too symmetrical to be the product of geological processes, and they were too regular to be the traces of any known animal behavior. For years, the circular patterns of Amami Oshima remained one of the enduring mysteries of Japanese marine biology. The answer came in 2011, when a team of researchers led by Hiroshi Kawase finally identified the creator of the formations. It was a small pufferfish, barely 5 inches long, a species previously unknown to science that was subsequently named Torquigina albimaculasis, and the formations were not random marks or accidental traces. They were architectural masterpieces, carefully constructed by the male pufferfish as part of an elaborate mating ritual. The researchers documented the construction process in extraordinary detail. Working alone, the male pufferfish begins by swimming in a circle on the sandy seabed, using his body and fins to push the sand outward from a central point. Over the course of 7 to 9 days, working day and night, the tiny fish creates a radial pattern of ridges and valleys that can be up to 20 times his own body length in diameter. The ridges are built up by the pufferfish pushing sand into elongated mounds with his pectoral fins, while the valleys between them are smoothed and deepened by the fanning of his tail. The precision of the construction is extraordinary. The ridges are evenly spaced, smoothly contoured, and arranged in a pattern of remarkable mathematical regularity. But the construction does not end with the radial ridges. The pufferfish also decorates the outer rim of the formation with fragments of coral and shell, pressing them into the sand at regular intervals to create an ornamental border. He excavates a shallow depression in the center of the formation, creating a smooth, bowl-shaped arena that will serve as the focal point of his mating display. And he smooths the surfaces of the inner ridges to a fine, uniform texture, using his body to rub and polish the sand until it is as flat and even as a manufactured surface. When the formation is complete, the male pufferfish begins his display. He swims in figure-8 patterns through the central depression, beating his fins and body against the sand to create vibrations that attract the attention of passing females. If a female is interested, she approaches the formation and inspects it, swimming slowly along the ridges and valleys, apparently evaluating the quality and precision of the construction. If she is satisfied, she enters the central depression, where mating takes place. The female deposits her eggs in the fine, smooth sand at the center of the formation, and the male fertilizes them. The eggs are then left in the central depression, where the carefully constructed ridges serve a functional purpose. They channel water currents toward the center of the formation in a way that ensures a steady flow of oxygenated water over the eggs, improving their chances of survival. The entire performance, the days of painstaking construction, the decorative embellishments, the courtship display, is one of the most extraordinary examples of animal behavior ever documented. The pufferfish is creating a structure that is simultaneously functional and aesthetic, a nursery for his offspring, and a work of art designed to attract a mate. The precision and complexity of the construction rival anything produced by much larger and more cognitively sophisticated animals, and the geometric regularity of the finished product would be impressive even by human standards. The discovery of the pufferfish's circular formations had an immediate impact on the debate about underwater structures and man-made origins. Here was proof, vivid and undeniable, that nature is capable of producing geometric patterns on the seafloor that look, at first glance, like the products of intelligent design. If a 5-inch fish can create a 6-foot circle of intricate radial symmetry, what other natural processes might be responsible for the geometric formations that have been observed and debated at underwater sites around the world? This is not to say that every geometric formation on the ocean floor is the work of a pufferfish or some other animal. The pufferfish formations are found in a specific region, at specific depths, in specific habitat types, and they have a characteristic appearance that is distinguishable from other types of seafloor patterns upon careful examination. But the broader lesson of the pufferfish discovery is that the line between natural and artificial, between the products of biology and the products of technology, is far more blurred than most people realize. The ocean floor is a canvas on which countless organisms leave their marks, and some of those marks are surprisingly sophisticated, surprisingly regular, and surprisingly easy to misinterpret. The Dumbo octopus and the pufferfish are just two examples from a vast and largely unstudied world of deep-sea behaviors that can produce marks, patterns, and structures on the seafloor. Other organisms contribute their own architectural marvels. Certain species of shrimp construct elaborate burrow systems in the sediment, complete with multiple chambers, connecting tunnels, and ventilation shafts. Some species of worms build tubes of cemented sand grains that can form dense, reef-like structures covering large areas of the seafloor. And the tracks, trails, and feeding marks of deep-sea animals can create patterns that persist for years or decades in the still, currentless waters of the abyss, creating a palimpsest of biological activity that can be extraordinarily difficult to distinguish from geological or artificial features. The lesson for underwater archaeology is clear. The interpretation of features observed on the ocean floor requires not just geological expertise, but also a deep understanding of marine biology and animal behavior. A formation that looks man-made to a geologist might be immediately recognizable to a marine biologist as the product of a specific organism's behavior. And a formation that looks natural to both a geologist and a biologist might, upon further investigation, turn out to be genuinely artificial, a product of human activity obscured and disguised by centuries of biological and geological modification. This interdisciplinary complexity is one of the reasons why underwater archaeology is so challenging and so fascinating. Every discovery on the ocean floor exists at the intersection of multiple fields of knowledge: geology, biology, oceanography, archaeology, history, and each field brings its own perspectives, methods, and biases to the interpretation of the evidence. Getting the answer right requires not just expertise in any one of these fields, but the ability to synthesize knowledge from all of them, to see the evidence from multiple angles simultaneously, and to resist the temptation to jump to conclusions based on incomplete data. It is a humbling exercise, and it is one that the exploration of the underwater world forces upon us again and again. The ocean is a place of immense complexity, where the boundaries between categories that seem clear and distinct on land, natural and artificial, living and dead, ancient and modern, become blurred and ambiguous. Navigating this complexity requires patience, rigor, and a willingness to be surprised by what we find. And it requires, above all, an openness to the possibility that the answers we seek may not fit neatly into any of the categories we have prepared for them. As we draw this first part of our journey to a close, let us take a moment to consider the enormity of what we have explored. We have descended into the waters of the Atlantic and found volcanic rock formations that have been mistaken for the ruins of Atlantis, reminding us that the human desire to find lost worlds can sometimes outrun the evidence. We have traveled to Southeast Asia and surveyed the drowned continent of Sundaland, a landmass as large as Europe that was home to our ancestors for over 100,000 years and that now lies entirely beneath the sea, its secrets all but untouched by modern science. We have stood in the harbor of Alexandria and watched as cutting-edge technology brings the ancient lighthouse back to life in digital form, allowing us to see one of the wonders of the ancient world as it has not been seen in over 500 years. We have peered at sonar images from the Caribbean that appeared to show an impossible sunken city, a discovery that remains unresolved and unexamined, a mystery that the ocean has not yet agreed to surrender. We have dived at Yonaguni and run our hands along stone terraces that might be the work of ancient builders or the patient sculpting of waves and currents over millennia. We have descended into the anoxic depths of the Black Sea and found a fleet of ancient ships preserved in a state of almost unbelievable completeness, a time capsule that has given us an entirely new window into the maritime world of the ancient Mediterranean. And we have marveled at the astonishing artistry of deep-sea creatures, organisms that create patterns and structures on the ocean floor that can fool even the most experienced human observers. Each of these stories is different, but they are all connected by a single, unifying theme. The ocean holds secrets that we have barely begun to discover. The floor of the sea is the largest and least explored archaeological site on Earth, a vast, dark frontier that contains the traces of tens of thousands of years of human activity, as well as the products of billions of years of biological and geological processes. We have mapped less than 20% of it in any detail. We have explored an even smaller fraction with our own eyes and instruments. And the stories it has to tell, the histories it has preserved, the mysteries it has yet to reveal, are beyond anything we can currently imagine. In the second part of our journey, we will continue our descent into the depths. We will explore additional sites and discoveries that challenge our understanding of the past. We will examine new evidence and new technologies that are pushing the boundaries of what is possible in underwater exploration. And we will confront, once again, the fundamental question that runs through every chapter of this story. How much of the human past lies hidden beneath the waves, and what will it tell us when we finally find it? The ocean does not hurry. It has been keeping its secrets for thousands of years, and it will keep them for thousands more if we let it. But for those who are willing to look, willing to dive, willing to invest the time and the technology and the patience required to explore the last great frontier on our planet, the rewards are waiting. They are down there in the dark, in the cold, in the silence. Structures of stone and wood and bone, the traces of lives lived and lost, the evidence of civilizations that rose and fell while the surface world knew nothing of their existence. The proof that the story of humanity is far longer, far more complex, and far more extraordinary than we have ever dared to imagine. The waters are deep, the mysteries are vast, and our journey has only just begun. We left our journey at the edge of the abyss, standing at the threshold of discoveries that challenge everything we believe we know about the human past. In the first part of our exploration, we surveyed drowned continents and submerged wonders, mysterious stone formations and perfectly preserved ancient vessels, the extraordinary artistry of deep-sea creatures, and the tantalizing possibility that the most important chapters of human history may be written not in the soil beneath our feet, but in the sediment beneath the sea. Now we descend again, deeper into the mystery, further into the evidence, further into the questions that the ocean refuses to answer easily. Because the deeper we go, the more we realize that the underwater world is not merely a repository of lost things. It is an active, living archive, constantly being written and rewritten by the forces of geology, biology, and the slow, inexorable movement of the Earth's tectonic plates. Every discovery we make down there reframes the ones that came before it. Every new piece of evidence shifts the picture slightly, revealing new contours, new shadows, new possibilities. And every time we think we understand something about the deep past, the ocean reminds us, with quiet and implacable authority, that we have barely scratched the surface. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. There is a concept in archaeology that is as simple as it is profound, and it is the concept that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. When we do not find something in the archaeological record, when there are no ruins, no artifacts, no written records of a particular culture or event, this does not necessarily mean that the culture or event did not exist. It may simply mean that we have not looked in the right place, or that we have not looked hard enough, or that the evidence has been destroyed by the relentless processes of time and nature. This concept is central to everything we have discussed so far, and it becomes even more critical as we push further into our exploration of the underwater world. Consider the state of our knowledge about human civilization during the period between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, the period immediately following the end of the last ice age. This is the era that geologists and archaeologists call the Holocene, and it is the period during which, according to the conventional historical narrative, human civilization began its dramatic transformation from small-scale hunter-gatherer societies to the complex, urban, agricultural civilizations that we recognize as the ancestors of our own world. Cities, writing, organized religion, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, all of these, the story goes, appeared for the first time in the fertile river valleys of the Middle East and North Africa during this period, in places like Jericho, Saddle Huruk, Eridu, and the Nile Delta. But here is the problem. The coastlines where the most dynamic and productive human communities would have lived during this period, the coasts of the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, were not where they are today. They were dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles further out to sea, on land that is now submerged beneath the waves. The agricultural revolution, the birth of cities, the development of writing and trade, all of these momentous events in the human story were playing out not just in the areas that are now dry land, but on coastlines and river deltas that have since been flooded. And the evidence of what happened on those drowned coastlines is now at the bottom of the sea. This is not a fringe theory or an alternative history fantasy. It is a straightforward consequence of the sea level history that we have already described, and it is a point that is increasingly being made by mainstream archaeologists who study the Holocene period. The post-glacial sea level rise was not just a geological event. It was one of the most significant disruptive forces in all of human history, a planetary-scale catastrophe that destroyed more archaeological evidence of early civilization than any other event in the human story. And because our search for the origins of civilization has focused almost entirely on dry land, we may be looking at a fundamentally incomplete picture. The implications become even more striking when we consider the specific geography of the sea level rise. The areas that were flooded as the glaciers melted were not uniform. Some regions experienced dramatic inundation, with the sea advancing many miles inland over the course of a few centuries. Others were flooded more gradually. And some of the most productive and attractive landscapes for human settlement, the gentle slopes of the continental shelves, the broad river deltas, the sheltered coastal bays, were precisely the areas that disappeared most completely beneath the rising ocean. Imagine the Tigris-Euphrates Delta as it existed 12,000 years ago. The Persian Gulf, which today is a broad, shallow sea, did not exist in anything like its current form. The northern portion of the Gulf was dry land, a broad, fertile plain watered by the rivers flowing down from the mountains of what is now Iran and Iraq. This plain, which geologist Farouk El-Baz has called the Gulf Oasis, was one of the most well-watered, biologically productive, and climatically favorable landscapes in the entire Middle East, a natural garden of resources that would have been almost irresistible to human settlement. And it is now entirely underwater. Similar scenarios played out around the coasts of the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific. The Nile Delta extended further into the Mediterranean during the Ice Age, and significant areas of the prehistoric delta are now submerged. The coast of India extended dozens of miles further into the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. The coasts of Southeast Asia, as we have already discussed, were transformed by the disappearance of Sundaland. Every continent on Earth lost significant portions of its most productive and habitable coastal land to the rising seas, and with that land went whatever traces of human civilization had accumulated on it over thousands of years. The question of what happened to the people who lived on these drowned coastlines is one of the most fascinating and least examined in all of history. Some of them clearly survived. The descendants of the coastal populations of the Ice Age are the people who eventually built the cities of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China. The genetic and cultural continuity between the Ice Age coastal populations and the first known civilizations is not in doubt. But what happened in between? What knowledge, what techniques, what stories did the coastal people carry with them as they retreated from the rising seas? And what did they leave behind? These questions are not merely academic. They touch on some of the most fundamental issues in the study of human origins and the development of civilization. If the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to complex, organized civilizations was driven in part by the experiences and knowledge accumulated by coastal communities over thousands of years before the end of the Ice Age, then the conventional timeline of civilization's origins may need to be pushed back considerably. The cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt may not have arisen spontaneously from nothing around 5,000 years ago, but rather may have been built by people who were drawing on a much longer tradition of social and technological development, a tradition that was born on coastlines that now lie beneath the sea. This is a hypothesis, not a proven fact, but it is a hypothesis that is supported by a growing body of evidence from genetics, linguistics, and the study of ancient mythology. Genetic studies have revealed that many of the population movements that shaped the modern world, including the spread of agriculture from the Middle East and the colonization of the Pacific by Austronesian seafarers, were intimately connected to the coastlines and the sea. Linguistic research has suggested that some of the world's oldest and most widely distributed language families may have originated in coastal regions, spreading inland as the seas rose. And the mythology of cultures around the world, from the flood stories of Mesopotamia and the Bible to the deluge myths of Hindu scripture and the indigenous traditions of coastal peoples everywhere, preserves a remarkably consistent memory of a time when the sea rose suddenly and devastatingly, swallowing the land and forcing the people to flee. These flood myths are among the most widespread and persistent stories in all of human culture. They appear in virtually every tradition that has been studied by anthropologists and folklorists on every inhabited continent in every major language family. The specific details vary, as one would expect from stories transmitted orally across thousands of years and thousands of miles, but the core narrative is strikingly consistent. The waters rose, the land was lost, and those who survived were forced to begin again on higher ground. Mainstream scholarship has traditionally interpreted these stories as cultural metaphors, symbolic narratives about catastrophe and survival, rather than literal memories of specific historical events. But a growing number of researchers argue that the flood myths may actually be cultural memories of the post-glacial sea level rise, preserved in the oral traditions of coastal peoples who experienced the flooding of their homelands and passed the story down through the generations. If this interpretation is correct, it would mean that human cultures have been preserving memories of geological events across spans of time measured in thousands of years, an extraordinary feat of collective memory that would have profound implications for our understanding of the reliability and significance of oral traditions. It would also mean that the flood myths contain real historical information about the geography and ecology of the pre-flood world, information that could potentially be used to guide the search for submerged archaeological sites. Some researchers have actually attempted to do exactly this. By combining the geographical information preserved in various flood myths with detailed bathymetric maps of the continental shelves and sea level reconstructions for different periods of the post-glacial rise, they have proposed specific locations where submerged settlements might be found. The results of this approach have been mixed, as one would expect when working with evidence of this kind. But in a few cases, the mythological clues have led researchers to sites that appear to contain genuine archaeological material, lending credibility to the idea that the flood myths encode real geographical knowledge. One of the most compelling examples comes from the coast of India, where a remarkable series of discoveries over the past 2 decades has challenged the conventional understanding of South Asian prehistory in a fundamental way. Gulf of Combat, also known as the Gulf of Cambay, is a narrow inlet on the northwestern coast of India, bordered by the modern state of Gujarat. It is a busy commercial waterway used by fishing boats and cargo vessels, and its waters are famously turbid, churned to opacity by the powerful tidal currents that rush in and out of the Gulf twice daily. Visibility underwater is effectively zero, which is why the discovery made here in 2001 was not made by divers but by sonar. A team from India's National Institute of Ocean Technology was conducting a routine pollution survey of the Gulf of Combat when their sonar equipment detected something unexpected on the seabed. At a depth of approximately 30 to 40 feet, the sonar images revealed a series of unusual features that did not match the pattern expected from a natural seafloor. There were what appeared to be rectilinear structures, linear features, and areas of raised topography arranged in a pattern that suggested the presence of submerged buildings or walls. The features extended across an area of approximately 5 miles in length, a substantial expanse of apparent structure on the ocean floor. When the team reported their findings, the initial reaction was skeptical. The Gulf of Combat is a heavily trafficked waterway, and the seafloor contains large quantities of debris, both natural and man-made, that can produce confusing sonar returns. The turbid water made direct visual inspection virtually impossible, and the depth of the structures, while not enormous, was puzzling. If these were man-made structures, they would have had to have been built during a period when the Gulf was substantially less flooded than today. But follow-up investigations produced results that were difficult to dismiss. Dredging operations in the area, conducted as part of ongoing pollution monitoring, brought up a series of artifacts from the seafloor. These included what appeared to be worked stone, including pieces of chert and other fine-grained rocks that had been shaped by percussion and pressure flaking, the classic techniques of prehistoric stone tool production. There were fragments of pottery, fired clay that appeared to be of human manufacture, and there were organic materials, including what appeared to be pieces of worked wood, and most intriguingly, fossilized human tooth fragments and animal bones. Carbon dating of some of the organic materials produced dates that sent shock waves through the archaeological community. The wood samples, if the dating was accurate, were approximately 9,000 years old, placing them in a period before the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the oldest known urban cultures in the world, had appeared on the historical stage. If the structures on the Gulf floor were genuinely associated with these materials, it would mean that a settlement of some kind had existed here nearly 9,000 years ago, at a time when the Gulf was shallower or possibly partially dry land, and that this settlement had been submerged by the rising sea some time afterward. The most enthusiastic proponents of the Gulf of Combat discovery went further, arguing that the scale and organization of the submerged structures suggested not merely a modest coastal settlement, but an early urban center, a predecessor to the Indus Valley civilization that would push the origins of South Asian urbanism back by thousands of years. They invoked the ancient Hindu epic texts, which speak of a great city called Dwarka that was swallowed by the sea at the end of the legendary Dvapara Yuga age, and suggested that the Gulf of Combat discovery might be the physical evidence behind this mythological tradition. The scientific response to these claims has been mixed, and in many cases, sharply critical. Mainstream archaeologists have pointed out several significant problems with the interpretation of the evidence. The dredged artifacts, while intriguing, were not recovered in controlled archaeological conditions. They came up in dredge buckets, mixed together without any record of their precise location, depth, or stratigraphic context. Without this contextual information, it is impossible to determine whether the artifacts were genuinely associated with the sonar-detected structures or simply happened to be in the same general area of the seafloor, mixed in with a jumble of natural sediment and other debris. The radiocarbon dates, while dramatic, were applied to wood samples whose provenance was uncertain. Wood can survive on the seafloor in various states of preservation and at various ages without necessarily being connected to any human activity. A piece of driftwood that sank to the bottom of the Gulf 9,000 years ago would produce the same radiocarbon date as a piece of structural timber from a 9,000-year-old building, but the former would tell us nothing about human settlement while the latter would be extraordinarily significant. Without a secure archaeological context, there is no way to distinguish between these possibilities. The sonar images themselves are also open to interpretation. The turbid, high-energy environment of the Gulf of Combat is not an ideal setting for sonar surveys, and the images that were obtained were of relatively low resolution. The structures detected could potentially be natural geological features, the products of erosion, tidal scouring, or sediment deposition, rather than man-made walls and buildings. Without direct visual inspection and physical sampling of the seafloor in controlled conditions, the nature of the structures remains uncertain. Despite these criticisms, the Gulf of Combat discovery has not disappeared from the scientific literature. Several subsequent studies have examined the dredged materials in more detail, and some researchers continue to argue that at least some of the artifacts are genuine products of human activity dating to a period before the Gulf was flooded to its current depth. The debate remains unresolved, and the limitations imposed by the turbid water and the lack of controlled excavation conditions mean that it may remain unresolved for some time. But the Gulf of Combat story is instructive in several ways. It illustrates the enormous potential of submerged landscape research in areas where coastal flooding has occurred, the genuine difficulty of conducting archaeological work in challenging underwater environments, and the tendency of both supporters and critics to overstate the certainty of their positions when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. It also illustrates the way in which mythological traditions, in this case the Hindu stories of the sunken city of Dwarka, can intersect with physical discoveries in ways that are simultaneously suggestive and confusing, opening up research directions while also introducing the risk of confirmation bias. The search for Dwarka has, in fact, been the subject of a separate and more rigorous program of underwater investigation. The modern city of Dwarka, on the northwestern tip of the Saurashtra Peninsula in Gujarat, is one of the sacred cities of Hinduism, and ancient texts describe it as having been repeatedly rebuilt over the centuries on sites that were progressively claimed by the sea. Archaeological investigations conducted by India's National Institute of Oceanography, beginning in the 1980s under the direction of the marine archaeologist S.R. Rao, have indeed found submerged structures in the waters off the coast of modern Dwarka, including what appear to be stone walls, anchors, and other artifacts lying on the seafloor at depths of up to 10 meters. Rao and his colleagues interpreted these structures as the remains of ancient ports and settlements that had been progressively submerged as the coastline shifted over the centuries. The finds included anchors of various types that could be dated to different periods of maritime history, bronze artifacts, pottery fragments, and stone sculpture. Some of the structural remains appeared to be associated with the historic and proto-historic periods of Indian history, while others might potentially date back further. Rao argued that his finds were consistent with the textual descriptions of ancient Dwarka and represented genuine archaeological evidence for the existence of a coastal settlement that had been partially or wholly submerged. The Dwarka investigations attracted considerable attention, both in India and internationally, and they have been cited by proponents of advanced ancient civilizations as evidence that the mythological history of India encodes genuine geographical and historical information about prehistoric coastal settlements. Critics have been more cautious, pointing out that the dating of the submerged artifacts is not always precise, that coastal erosion and subsidence can produce apparent submergence of relatively recent structures without implying any dramatic sea level change, and that the connection between the physical finds and the specific mythological tradition of Dwarka is difficult to establish with confidence. What the Dwarka investigations do demonstrate, however, is that serious, rigorous underwater archaeology can be conducted in coastal waters with significant results, and that the submerged margins of the Indian coast contain genuine archaeological material that provides evidence of human activity in periods and places that have not been studied by terrestrial archaeology. Whether this material represents the sunken city of ancient mythology or simply the accumulated debris of coastal communities progressively displaced by erosion and sea level change is a question that will require much more investigation to answer. The story of underwater exploration is, at its heart, a story about technology. Every advance in the tools we use to explore the deep sea, from the earliest diving bells and hard hat suits to modern remotely operated vehicles and autonomous underwater vehicles, has opened new doors and revealed new possibilities. And the pace of technological development in this field has been accelerating dramatically in recent years, driven by advances in computing, robotics, materials science, and sensing technology that are transforming what is possible beneath the waves. One of the most significant recent developments in underwater archaeology has been the adoption of photogrammetry and three-dimensional scanning techniques, technologies that we have already encountered in the context of the Pharos project in Alexandria. But the applications of these techniques extend far beyond any single site. Photogrammetry, the science of creating three-dimensional models from overlapping photographs, has become a standard tool in the underwater archaeologist's arsenal, allowing detailed, accurate, and permanent records to be made of submerged sites and artifacts with a fraction of the time and cost that would be required for traditional measurement and drawing techniques. The development of underwater photogrammetry has been driven partly by advances in digital camera technology and computing power, and partly by the ingenuity of researchers who have adapted techniques originally developed for terrestrial applications to the challenging environment of the underwater world. Working underwater introduces a series of complications that do not exist on land. Water refracts light differently than air, which means that photographs taken underwater are subject to geometric distortions that must be corrected by specialized software. The turbidity and color absorption of water affect the appearance and color accuracy of underwater images, particularly at greater depths. And the practical difficulties of moving precisely and steadily through three-dimensional water space, while carrying cameras and lighting equipment and managing air supply, add layers of complexity that require specialized training and equipment. Despite these challenges, underwater photogrammetry has produced results of astonishing quality at sites around the world. Detailed three-dimensional models of shipwrecks, submerged buildings, and underwater landscape features are now being created routinely by research teams, providing permanent records of sites that might otherwise deteriorate or be disturbed before they can be properly studied. The models can be used not just for documentation and analysis but also for public outreach, being posted online and made accessible to anyone with a computer, allowing people anywhere in the world to virtually explore archaeological sites that they could never physically visit. But photogrammetry, impressive as it is, represents only the beginning of the technological revolution that is transforming underwater exploration. Perhaps the most significant recent development has been the rapid advancement of autonomous underwater vehicle, or AUV, technology. Unlike remotely operated vehicles, which are controlled in real time by operators on the surface and are constrained by the length of their tether cables, AUVs are fully autonomous, capable of navigating complex environments, collecting data, and making decisions without any direct human input. They are programmed with a mission before deployment, then sent out to execute that mission independently, returning to the surface when their work is done or their batteries are depleted. AUVs are already being used extensively in oceanographic research, mapping the topography and geology of the deep seafloor with a precision and efficiency that would have been impossible with tethered vehicles. The images and data they collect are of extraordinary quality, thanks to advances in sonar technology, imaging systems, and data processing algorithms that allow even small features on the seafloor to be detected and characterized. And as the technology continues to develop, AUVs are becoming smaller, cheaper, more capable, and more accessible, opening up the possibility of large-scale surveys of the deep ocean floor that were previously beyond the reach of any research institution. For underwater archaeology, the implications of AUV technology are profound. One of the fundamental limitations of conventional underwater archaeological work is the enormous cost and logistical difficulty of searching large areas of the seafloor for potential sites. Even with the most sophisticated surface-towed sonar systems, covering a significant area of the ocean floor in enough detail to identify archaeological features is a slow, expensive, and labor-intensive process. AUVs, which can operate continuously for extended periods at much lower cost than crewed research vessels, offer the possibility of dramatically accelerating and expanding the search for submerged archaeological sites. Several research groups around the world are already exploring the use of AUVs in archaeological surveys. In the Mediterranean, AUVs have been used to survey large areas of the seafloor in search of ancient shipwrecks, with considerable success. The vehicle's high-resolution sonar systems can detect even relatively small objects on the seabed from a distance of tens of meters, and their precise navigation allows them to cover search areas systematically and efficiently. When a potential target is identified in the sonar data, the AUV can be reprogrammed to make a closer pass over the site, collecting higher resolution data that allows the target to be better characterized. If the closer inspection confirms the presence of something archaeologically significant, a tethered ROV or diving team can then be deployed for detailed investigation and documentation. This kind of multi-stage survey approach, using the efficiency of AUVs for initial reconnaissance and the precision of ROVs or divers for follow-up investigation, is becoming the standard methodology for large-scale underwater archaeological surveys. It represents a significant improvement over previous approaches, both in terms of the area that can be covered and the quality of the data that can be collected. And as the technology continues to improve, the results are likely to be increasingly dramatic. Another technological development that is having a significant impact on underwater exploration is the advancement of underwater acoustic communication and navigation systems. One of the persistent challenges of working in the underwater environment is the difficulty of communicating between submerged vehicles or divers and the surface. Radio waves do not propagate well through water, which means that the wireless communication technologies that are ubiquitous on the surface are essentially useless underwater. Instead, underwater communication relies on acoustic signals, sound waves that travel much more effectively through water than electromagnetic radiation. But acoustic communication is slow, has limited bandwidth, and is subject to interference from the complex acoustic environment of the ocean. Recent advances in underwater acoustic modem technology have significantly improved the speed and reliability of underwater communication, allowing real-time data transmission between AUVs or ROVs and surface vessels or control stations. This improved communication capability is making it possible to conduct more dynamic and responsive underwater surveys, in which operators on the surface can monitor incoming data in real time and adjust the mission parameters of an AUV in response to what is being found. Rather than programming a fixed survey mission before deployment and waiting for the AUV to return with its data, operators can now interact with the vehicle during the mission, directing it toward interesting features and away from unproductive areas, greatly increasing the efficiency and scientific value of each deployment. The combination of improved AUV technology, high-resolution sonar, real-time communication, and advanced data processing is creating what some researchers describe as a revolution in ocean exploration, a fundamental transformation of what is possible in the study of the deep seafloor that is comparable in its implications to the invention of the telescope or the microscope. Just as those instruments opened up entirely new dimensions of the natural world to scientific investigation, the new generation of underwater exploration technology is opening up the ocean floor as a field of study in a way that was simply not possible even a decade ago. But technology alone is not enough. The most sophisticated AUV in the world is useless without the knowledge to interpret the data it collects, and the interpretation of underwater archaeological data requires expertise that is still in short supply. The field of underwater or maritime archaeology is relatively young compared to terrestrial archaeology, and the number of trained specialists worldwide is small. Training new underwater archaeologists requires time, resources, and the kind of sustained institutional commitment that is not always easy to secure in an academic environment where funding is scarce and priorities are constantly shifting. There is also a fundamental tension between the pace of discovery and the pace of analysis. As technology makes it possible to survey larger and larger areas of the ocean floor, the volume of data being generated is growing exponentially. The images, sonar recordings, three-dimensional models, and other data products flowing out of modern underwater exploration programs represent a torrent of information that even the most dedicated research teams struggle to keep up with. Developing the analytical tools and methods needed to make sense of this data, to distinguish genuine archaeological features from natural formations, to understand the spatial relationships between different elements of a site, and to extract meaningful historical information from the evidence, is a challenge that will occupy underwater archaeologists for decades to come. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are increasingly being applied to this problem, with some promising results. Algorithms trained on large datasets of sonar images and seafloor photographs are showing growing ability to automatically identify potential archaeological features in large volumes of data, flagging areas of interest for human review and dramatically reducing the time required to analyze the output of large-scale surveys. These tools are still in their early stages of development, and their accuracy and reliability vary considerably depending on the nature of the data and the specific features being sought. But the direction of travel is clear. The combination of robotic data collection and algorithmic analysis is opening up the possibility of archaeological surveys at a scale that would be completely impractical with human labor alone. All of these technological developments are exciting in the abstract, but they become truly compelling when we see them applied to specific places and specific mysteries. And few mysteries are more compelling or more in need of new technological approaches than the ongoing investigation of the underwater landscape off the coast of Japan, where the Yonaguni Monument sits at the intersection of geology, archaeology, and an ancient cultural tradition that may have preserved memories of a very different world. We have already examined the Yonaguni Monument in some detail, describing its terrace structure, the controversy over its natural or artificial origin, and the arguments put forward by researchers on both sides of the debate. Now let us dig deeper into the broader context of the Yonaguni discovery, exploring what the monument might mean if it does turn out to be man-made, and what the geological history of the region tells us about the kinds of environments that existed here during the last ice age. The Ryukyu Islands, the chain of which Yonaguni is the westernmost member, are a fascinating geological environment. They form a curved arc of volcanic and limestone islands stretching for nearly 1,000 miles between the Japanese mainland and Taiwan, perched atop the edge of the continental shelf where the Pacific and Eurasian plates interact. The geology of the islands is complex and varied, with volcanic rocks, limestone formations, and marine sediments all present in different combinations across the archipelago. The waters around the islands are clear and warm, warmed by the Kuroshio Current, and they support diverse coral reef ecosystems that attract divers from around the world. During the last ice age, when sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than today, the Ryukyu Islands were significantly different places. The shallow seas between many of the islands dried up, connecting them to one another and to the East Asian mainland by broad stretches of dry land. The island of Yonaguni itself was part of a much larger landmass that extended westward toward Taiwan, which was itself connected to the Chinese mainland. The continental shelf in this region, which is now submerged beneath the East China Sea, was a broad, flat plain, likely covered by savanna and forest vegetation, watered by rivers flowing down from the mountains of what are now the larger islands. This ice age landscape would have been a highly attractive environment for human habitation. The proximity to the coast, the abundant marine resources, the mild climate moderated by the ocean, all of these factors would have made the region an ideal place for human communities. And there is genetic and archaeological evidence that the Ryukyu Islands were indeed inhabited during the late Paleolithic period, tens of thousands of years before the end of the Ice Age. The Minatagawa Man, a set of anatomically modern human remains found in Okinawa, and dated to approximately 18,000 years ago, demonstrates that people were living in the Ryukyu archipelago during the height of the last glaciation, at a time when much of the surrounding continental shelf was still dry land. If people were living in the Ryukyu Islands 18,000 years ago, it is reasonable to assume that they were also living on the adjacent continental shelf, on the broad, flat plain that has since been submerged by the rising sea. And if those people were anything like other late Paleolithic human communities, they were capable of creating permanent structures, modifying their environment, and expressing themselves through art and symbolic behavior. The question is whether any trace of their presence on the now submerged shelf has survived the flooding of the landscape and the subsequent thousands of years of marine erosion and sedimentation. This is where the Yonaguni Monument becomes potentially significant, regardless of whether it turns out to be natural or man-made. The monument sits at a depth of 75 feet, which corresponds roughly to the sea level that prevailed approximately 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. If the terraced sandstone formation was above water at that time, it would have been a prominent feature of the landscape, a raised platform of bedrock rising from the surrounding plain that would have been visible from a considerable distance, and that would naturally have attracted human attention. Even if the basic form of the monument is entirely natural, human communities living in the area during the Ice Age might have used it as a landmark, a gathering place, a quarry, or a site for ceremonial activity, and in doing so might have modified its surfaces in ways that are difficult to distinguish from the marks of natural erosion. The possibility of this kind of hybrid site, a natural geological feature that has been secondarily modified by human activity, is one that deserves serious attention at Yonaguni and at other apparently enigmatic underwater sites. Archaeologists working on land are familiar with the concept of natural places that have been modified and incorporated into human cultural landscapes. Sacred mountains, remarkable rock formations, natural caves, all of these have been used and modified by human communities throughout history. There is no reason why similar processes would not have applied to coastal and underwater landscapes during the Ice Age, and the result might be exactly what we see at Yonaguni, a natural structure whose appearance has been subtly altered by human use in ways that are neither obvious nor easy to prove. The ongoing investigation of Yonaguni and similar sites around the world is increasingly making use of new technologies that were not available to the researchers who conducted the initial studies in the 1990s. High-resolution multi-beam sonar has been used to create detailed topographic maps of the monument and its surrounding seafloor, revealing features that are not visible to divers but that show up clearly in the sonar data. Photogrammetric models have been created from thousands of overlapping photographs, allowing the geometry of the monument's surfaces to be analyzed with millimeter precision. And sediment samples collected from crevices and depressions on the monument's surface are being analyzed for pollen, phytoliths, and other microscopic biological remains that might provide evidence of the terrestrial vegetation that existed when the monument was above water. The results of these investigations have been, as with so much in this field, tantalizing rather than conclusive. The high-resolution sonar maps have revealed additional features in the vicinity of the monument that were not previously known, including what appear to be similar terraced formations at various depths on the surrounding seafloor. Whether these additional features represent a series of related structures, either natural or man-made, or simply reflect the general character of the local geology, is not yet clear. The photogrammetric analysis has confirmed the geometric regularity of the monument's surfaces, but has not resolved the question of whether this regularity is the product of natural fracturing or human modification. And the sediment analyses are still in progress, with results expected in the coming years. The investigation of Yonaguni is, in many ways, a microcosm of the broader challenge of underwater archaeology, the slow, painstaking accumulation of evidence in the face of enormous interpretive uncertainty, using the best available technology to tease out signals from a background of noise. Progress is measured not in dramatic revelations but in the gradual narrowing of the range of possibilities, the elimination of hypotheses that cannot account for the evidence, and the refinement of the questions that need to be asked. It is frustrating and it is expensive, and it does not make for compelling television, but it is how science actually works, and it is the only reliable path to the truth. As we continue our exploration of the underwater world, we must turn our attention to a category of discovery that is fundamentally different from everything we have examined so far. Not an enigmatic stone formation, not a submerged landscape, not a preserved shipwreck, but a living ecosystem, a community of organisms that has been quietly going about its business in the depths of the ocean for millions of years, largely unknown to science and only recently beginning to be understood. The deep ocean is often described as the last unexplored frontier on Earth, and the description is apt. Below a depth of about 3,000 feet, sunlight effectively disappears, and the world becomes a place of perpetual darkness, extreme cold, and crushing pressure. The conditions seem utterly inhospitable to complex life, and for much of the history of marine biology, scientists assumed that the deep ocean was largely barren, a cold, dark desert populated only by the simplest of organisms. This assumption has been comprehensively overturned by the scientific work of the past few decades, which has revealed that the deep ocean is in fact extraordinarily rich in life, home to an astonishing diversity of organisms that have evolved remarkable adaptations to the extreme conditions of the abyss. Among the most fascinating and least studied of these deep-sea organisms are the cephalopods, the group of animals that includes squids, octopuses, and cuttlefish. Cephalopods are among the most cognitively sophisticated invertebrates on Earth, with complex nervous systems, remarkable problem-solving abilities, and behavioral repertoires of surprising richness and diversity. The shallow water species of cephalopod have been studied intensively by marine biologists, and much is known about their behavior, ecology, and neurobiology. But the deep-sea cephalopods, which include some of the largest and most remarkable species in the group, remain largely mysterious, glimpsed only occasionally by remotely operated vehicles and rarely studied in any detail. The Dumbo octopus, which we introduced briefly in the first part of our journey, is one of the most enchanting of the deep-sea cephalopods. Its graceful ear-fin swimming style, its translucent body, and its gentle, almost ethereal appearance in the headlights of an ROV have made it one of the most popular subjects of deep-sea video footage, and images and videos of Dumbo octopuses have been widely shared online and in natural history documentaries. But beyond its visual appeal, the Dumbo octopus is a remarkable organism whose biology and behavior are only now beginning to be understood. Dumbo octopuses are members of the family Opisthodothidae, a group of deep-sea octopuses characterized by the large, ear-like fins that give the Dumbo its common name. They are found throughout the world's oceans, at depths ranging from 3,000 to over 13,000 feet, making them among the most wide-ranging and deep-living of all octopus species. Unlike their shallow water relatives, which are typically bottom-dwelling animals that spend most of their time crawling over rocks and reefs, Dumbo octopuses are primarily pelagic, meaning that they spend much of their time swimming freely through the water column rather than resting on the seafloor. This semi-pelagic lifestyle is reflected in their anatomy. The large fins that give them their distinctive appearance are highly effective propulsion organs, capable of generating the gentle, sustained movements needed for hovering in place or swimming slowly through the water. Their arms, while equipped with suckers like those of other octopuses, are webbed with thin membranes that can be extended to create a bell-like structure similar to that of a jellyfish, useful for capturing prey. And their bodies are soft and gelatinous, with a relatively thin skin and a lack of the rigid internal structures found in many other cephalopods, adaptations that help them withstand the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. The Dumbo octopus feeds primarily on small crustaceans, worms, and other invertebrates that live on or near the seafloor. Unlike shallow water octopuses, which typically use a combination of speed and strength to capture their prey, Dumbos appear to rely on a more gentle approach, hovering just above the bottom and using their arms and webbing to feel through the sediment for food items. This feeding behavior produces the radial patterns in the sediment that we discussed earlier, patterns that can persist long after the octopus has moved on, and that can be mistaken by unwary observers for the traces of human activity. The discovery of new Dumbo octopus species continues at a steady pace. Because deep-sea octopuses are so rarely encountered and so difficult to study, our understanding of their diversity is based primarily on preserved specimens recovered as bycatch in deep-sea fishing operations or collected by research vessels. These preserved specimens provide information about anatomy and genetics but tell us nothing about behavior, and the behavior of deep-sea cephalopods is one of the great mysteries of marine biology. The few observations that have been made with ROVs and AUVs have revealed behaviors that are surprising and intriguing. including what appears to be complex interactions between individuals and evidence of sophisticated sensory capabilities that seem at odds with the extreme simplicity of the deep ocean environment. One of the most remarkable observations of deep-sea cephalopod behavior made in recent years involves not the Dumbo octopus but one of its larger relatives, the giant squid, Architeuthis dux. The giant squid is one of the largest invertebrates on Earth, capable of reaching lengths of over 40 feet, and it has been the subject of myth and legend for centuries. Sailors' tales of encounters with the legendary kraken, a sea monster of enormous proportions that was said to drag ships to the bottom of the ocean, are widely believed to have been inspired by sightings of giant squid. But despite its enormous size and legendary status, the giant squid remained virtually unknown to science for most of the history of marine biology. Dead or dying specimens washed up on beaches occasionally, providing material for anatomical study, and squid beaks were regularly recovered from the stomachs of sperm whales, which are known to prey on giant squid. But live, healthy giant squid had never been observed in their natural habitat. That changed in 2004, when a team of Japanese researchers, led by Tsunemi Kubodra, succeeded for the first time in photographing a live giant squid in the wild. Using a baited camera suspended at a depth of approximately 3,000 feet in the North Pacific, the team captured hundreds of photographs of a giant squid attacking and briefly holding the bait before breaking free, one of its tentacles remaining attached to the camera and providing a precious biological sample. The photographs were extraordinary, confirming the enormous size of the animal and revealing details of its behavior and appearance that had never previously been observed. The successful observation of the giant squid in the wild opened a new chapter in the study of deep-sea cephalopods, and subsequent expeditions have built on this success. In 2012, a team of researchers from Japan and the United States succeeded in capturing video footage of a live giant squid in the deep ocean for the first time, using a specially designed submersible equipped with near-infrared lighting that was invisible to the squid. The footage was extraordinary, showing the animal's iridescent silver color, its enormous eyes, and its powerful, fluid movement through the water. It was a vivid demonstration of how much remains unknown about even the most famous of deep-sea animals, and a reminder of the extraordinary diversity and complexity of life in the deep ocean. The significance of these observations for our broader exploration of the underwater world lies not just in what they reveal about individual species, but in what they suggest about the overall richness and complexity of deep-sea ecosystems. If an animal as large and famous as the giant squid could remain essentially unstudied in its natural habitat until well into the 21st century, what else might be living in the deep ocean that we have barely begun to discover? The history of deep-sea biology is a history of surprises, of organisms so strange and so unlike anything known from the surface world that they challenge fundamental assumptions about the limits of life. And as our ability to explore the deep ocean improves, the pace of discovery is accelerating. This richness of deep-sea life is directly relevant to the interpretation of features observed on the ocean floor. The marks, patterns, and structures created by deep-sea organisms are far more diverse and complex than most people realize, and the potential for these biological features to be confused with geological or archaeological features is significant. Understanding the biology of the deep ocean is not just an academic exercise. It is an essential prerequisite for the accurate interpretation of anything observed on the seafloor, whether by sonar, ROV camera, or AUV sensor. The pufferfish, whose extraordinary mating circles we described in our first journey, is just one member of an enormous and diverse group of fish species that create complex structures on the seafloor for reproductive purposes. Across the world's oceans, from the shallow coral reefs of the tropics to the cold, sandy bottoms of temperate seas, fish have evolved a remarkable variety of nest-building behaviors, producing structures that range from simple depressions scooped out of the sand to elaborate, three-dimensional constructions of plant material, shells, and other debris. Some of these fish-built structures are remarkable for their geometric precision. The peacock flounder, a flat fish found in the shallow sandy bottoms of tropical and subtropical seas, creates nest depressions of almost perfect circular symmetry, scooping out the sand with powerful undulations of its body and fins to produce a bowl-shaped depression whose dimensions are strikingly consistent from individual to individual. The stickleback, a small freshwater and estuarine fish widely studied by ethologists, builds elaborate cylindrical nests of plant material, gluing the pieces together with a secretion from its kidneys, that are models of engineering precision for an animal that has no hands and no tools. The Japanese pufferfish takes this nest-building behavior to an extreme that, as we have already described, produces structures of almost incomprehensible beauty and complexity. But it is worth emphasizing just how important the discovery of this behavior has been for the study of animal cognition and the evolution of complex behavior. The pufferfish's circular formations are not simply the product of instinct in the narrow sense, a fixed action pattern triggered by hormones and performed identically by every individual. They show significant variation between individuals, suggesting that each fish is making choices and adjustments throughout the construction process, adapting its behavior to the specific conditions of the local environment. Some formations are larger than others, some have more ridges, some have more elaborate decoration, and the fish continues to modify and repair the formation throughout the mating season, responding to damage caused by currents or other disturbances. This behavioral flexibility suggests a level of cognitive sophistication that is remarkable for an animal with a brain the size of a pea. It raises profound questions about the evolution of complex behavior and the relationship between brain size and cognitive capability, questions that have important implications not just for marine biology, but for our understanding of animal intelligence more broadly. And it provides yet another example of the ways in which the underwater world can surprise and confound our expectations, producing phenomena that seem to require intelligence and design, but that turn out to be the products of evolutionary processes acting on relatively simple organisms. The discovery of the pufferfish's circular formations also has direct practical implications for the interpretation of similar patterns observed elsewhere on the seafloor. As underwater survey technology improves and more of the ocean floor is systematically documented, patterns and formations of various kinds are being discovered with increasing frequency. Some of these, like the pufferfish circles, have already been identified as the products of animal behavior. Others remain unexplained, and the lesson of the pufferfish is that unexplained seafloor patterns should not be assumed to be artificial simply because they appear regular or geometric. This does not mean that all apparently regular seafloor patterns are biological in origin. It does mean that before concluding that a pattern is man-made, all natural explanations, both geological and biological, must be rigorously excluded. This is a higher standard of evidence than has sometimes been applied in the study of enigmatic underwater features, and meeting it requires a level of interdisciplinary expertise and methodological rigor that is not always available to the teams conducting the initial surveys. But it is the standard that is required if we are to avoid the error of seeing the hand of ancient civilization in the work of nature, and it is the standard to which the best underwater archaeological research aspires. The tension between the desire to discover the extraordinary and the need to be rigorously scientific is one that runs through the entire history of underwater exploration. And it is nowhere more apparent than in the ongoing debate about the nature and origins of the structures discovered in various locations around the world that have been proposed as evidence of lost civilizations. We have already examined several of these sites in detail: the Azores, Sundaland, the Gulf of Combat, Cuba, and Yonaguni. Each of these cases illustrates a different aspect of the challenge of studying underwater remains, and each has contributed to the ongoing development of the methods and standards that the field uses to evaluate claims of submerged human activity. But there are many more sites around the world where similar debates are playing out, where sonar images or diver reports have identified features on the seafloor that appear to be regular, geometric, or otherwise anomalous, and where the question of natural versus artificial origin has not yet been definitively answered. Some of these sites are in waters so deep or so remote that they have not been seriously investigated. Others have been studied in enough detail to rule out an artificial origin, but the findings have not yet been widely disseminated. And a few are genuinely uncertain, cases where the available evidence is ambiguous and where the honest scientific answer is that we simply do not know. One region that has attracted considerable attention in recent years is the coast of Malta, a small Mediterranean island nation that is already famous for its extraordinary prehistoric monuments, including some of the oldest stone temples in the world, built by a culture that flourished between approximately 5,500 and 2,500 BCE. The Maltese temple builders created structures of remarkable sophistication, incorporating astronomical alignments, decorative carving, and complex spatial organization in ways that reflect a highly developed architectural tradition. The temples are found across the island of Malta and its smaller neighbor Gozo, and they represent some of the most impressive prehistoric monuments anywhere in Europe. But what is less widely known is that there are also reported structures in the waters around Malta, on the seafloor of the surrounding Mediterranean. Divers exploring the coastal waters of Malta have reported finding what appear to be cart ruts, a feature that is well known on the surface of the islands, carved into the rock of the seafloor at depths of several meters. The surface cart ruts of Malta are one of the island's great archaeological mysteries, deep grooves carved into the limestone bedrock that appear to be the tracks of heavy-wheeled vehicles, though the culture that made them and the specific purpose they served remain unclear. The discovery of apparent cart ruts on the seafloor has been taken by some researchers as evidence that the Maltese landscape extended further into the sea during a period of lower sea levels, and that the cart rut-making culture was active on this now submerged land. The interpretation of the seafloor cart ruts is complicated by the fact that natural geological processes can produce groove-like features in limestone that superficially resemble cart ruts. The limestone bedrock of the Mediterranean region is particularly susceptible to dissolution by slightly acidic rainwater, a process called karst dissolution, which can produce a variety of groove, pit, and channel features that can be difficult to distinguish from artificial carvings. The underwater environment adds additional complexity, because wave action, bioerosion, and sediment transport can all modify the surfaces of submerged limestone formations in ways that blur the distinction between natural and artificial features. Rigorous investigation of the underwater cart ruts of Malta would require detailed photographic documentation, precise measurement of the groove dimensions and profiles, geological analysis of the surrounding rock, and comparison with known examples of both artificial and natural groove features. This kind of investigation is technically feasible, but has not yet been conducted at the level of detail that would be required to reach a definitive conclusion. The underwater features of Malta remain, like so many of the sites we have discussed, in a state of intriguing uncertainty, neither confirmed nor definitively ruled out as evidence of submerged human activity. The recurring pattern in all of these cases, the initial excitement of discovery, the subsequent controversy, the slow and uncertain process of investigation, the frustrating persistence of ambiguity, reflects the genuine difficulty of the questions being asked. The boundary between what is natural and what is artificial on the ocean floor is not always clear, and the tools and methods needed to draw that boundary reliably are still being developed. The field of underwater archaeology is young, and the standards of evidence and interpretation are still being worked out. The combination of technical challenge, interpretive complexity, and the enormous cultural and scientific significance of the questions at stake makes it one of the most exciting and one of the most contested fields in all of science. Among the many dimensions of the underwater world that remain poorly understood, perhaps none is more important for the future of underwater archaeology than the chemistry and biology of seafloor sediment. The sediment that covers the vast majority of the ocean floor is not simply a passive layer of inert material. It is a dynamic, biologically active environment in which complex chemical and biological processes are constantly occurring, processes that have profound effects on the preservation and destruction of any organic or inorganic material that falls onto the seabed. We have already seen in our examination of the Black Sea how the absence of oxygen in the water column can dramatically improve the preservation of organic materials on the seafloor, protecting wooden shipwrecks from the bacterial and fungal decay that would destroy them in oxygenated waters. But the Black Sea is an extreme case, a body of water with a uniquely anoxic deep water column that exists because of its particular geography and hydrology. In most of the world's oceans, the situation is very different. The bottom waters are oxygenated, and the seafloor sediment is home to a thriving community of bacteria, worms, sea cucumbers, and other organisms that actively process and modify anything that settles onto it. This seafloor community, known as the benthic community, plays a crucial role in the global cycling of carbon and nutrients, breaking down organic material and releasing it back into the water column in forms that can be used by other organisms. For marine ecology, this is an essential and beneficial process. For underwater archaeology, it is a major problem, because the same organisms that cycle nutrients also destroy the organic materials that might otherwise provide evidence of past human activity. A wooden artifact that falls onto an oxygenated seafloor will will be attacked immediately by wood-boring organisms, bacteria, and fungi, and will typically be reduced to unrecognizable fragments within a few decades. Inorganic materials, stone and fired clay and metal, are more resistant to biological attack, but they are not immune to the chemical and physical processes of the benthic environment. Stone surfaces can be colonized by encrusting organisms, which chemically modify the rock's surface and can obscure tool marks and other features. Clay ceramics can be softened and disintegrated by repeated wetting and drying in shallow water environments. Metals are subject to corrosion, which can alter their form and make identification difficult. And all materials on the seafloor are subject to burial by sedimentation, with ongoing deposition of particles settling out of the water column, gradually covering artifacts and structures over time. The rate of sedimentation on the seafloor varies enormously from place to place, from a few millimeters per 1,000 years in the abyssal plains of the deep ocean to several centimeters per year in the productive waters near coastlines and river mouths. In areas of high sedimentation, artifacts can be buried relatively quickly, which can actually be beneficial for preservation, since burial protects them from biological attack and physical disturbance. Some of the best preserved archaeological material from underwater sites is found in deeply buried contexts, covered by layers of sediment that accumulated after the site was abandoned or flooded. The challenge for underwater archaeologists is detecting and accessing this buried material. Artifacts lying on the surface of the seafloor are relatively easy to find with sonar or visual survey, but deeply buried material is essentially invisible to conventional remote sensing techniques. Detecting buried features requires either invasive excavation, which is expensive, slow, and potentially damaging to the site, or the use of specialized geophysical techniques such as sub-bottom profiling, which uses acoustic signals to penetrate the seafloor and reveal the stratigraphy of buried layers. Sub-bottom profiling has been used with considerable success at several underwater archaeological sites, revealing the presence of buried structures and artifacts that were not visible on the surface of the seafloor. The technique works by emitting a pulse of sound that penetrates the seafloor sediment and reflects back from boundaries between layers of different density or composition. The pattern of reflections can be used to construct an image of the subsurface stratigraphy, identifying buried channels, pit features, floors, and other archaeological features. When combined with surface sonar surveys and direct ROV inspection, sub-bottom profiling can provide a much more complete picture of a site's archaeological potential than any single technique alone. The development of more powerful and higher resolution sub-bottom profiling systems is one of the technological priorities for underwater archaeology in the coming years. Current systems can detect features at depths of several meters below the seafloor surface, but their resolution is limited, and small or subtle features may be missed. Improved systems with higher frequency and greater resolution would dramatically expand the range of archaeological features that can be detected remotely, making it possible to identify potential sites and plan excavation strategies with much greater precision and efficiency. Another technological development that promises to revolutionize the study of buried underwater archaeological material is the application of environmental DNA, or eDNA, analysis to marine sediment. Environmental DNA is genetic material shed by organisms into their surrounding environment, where it persists for varying periods of time, depending on the chemical conditions of the environment. In marine sediment, eDNA from past human occupations, including DNA from human skin cells, food remains, domesticated plants and animals, and even the bacteria associated with human gut microbiomes, can potentially survive for thousands of years, providing a biological record of past human presence that does not depend on the survival of any physical artifact. The analysis of eDNA from marine sediment is still in its early stages, but the technique has already been applied successfully to several terrestrial archaeological sites, where it has detected human and animal DNA in contexts where no other evidence of occupation was visible. The extension of this technique to underwater sites is technically challenging because the marine environment contains an enormous background of biological material that can obscure the signals from past human activity. But researchers are developing increasingly sophisticated methods for filtering out this background noise and detecting the specific genetic signatures of human presence, and the results of early trials are promising. If eDNA analysis can be reliably applied to marine sediment, it would open up an entirely new approach to the survey of submerged landscapes, one that does not depend on the presence of visible structures or artifacts, but can detect the chemical traces of human occupation directly in the sediment. This would be particularly valuable in the investigation of sites from periods when human populations were small and mobile, and did not leave the kinds of substantial permanent structures that are detectable by conventional remote sensing. The evidence from hunter-gatherer communities, for instance, might be too ephemeral to show up in sonar surveys, but the eDNA of the people themselves might still be preserved in the sediment of sites where they camped, fished, or processed food thousands of years ago. The investigation of the underwater world has always been driven, at its deepest level, not by technology or funding or institutional ambition, but by a fundamental human impulse, the desire to know where we came from. Every excavation, every sonar survey, every remote sensing mission to the ocean floor is, at its heart, an attempt to recover a piece of the human story that has been lost to time and tide. And the reason this work matters, the reason it deserves the attention and resources and passion that so many people bring to it, is that the story of our origins is not merely an academic question. It is the foundation of our understanding of who we are, where we belong, and what we are capable of as a species. The conventional history of human civilization, the one that fills our textbooks and museum displays and popular science narratives, begins relatively recently. The oldest cities, the first writing systems, the earliest monumental architecture, all of these appear in the record within the last 6,000 years or so, a period that seems long by human standards, but that represents less than 3% of the time that anatomically modern humans have been on Earth. Before this period, the conventional narrative implies, human life was essentially static, small bands of people moving through the landscape in search of food, occasionally creating remarkable art but never developing the organized, complex societies that we associate with civilization. This picture is increasingly being challenged, not just by alternative theorists and fringe researchers, but by mainstream scientists working with rigorous methods and careful attention to evidence. Genetic studies have revealed patterns of population migration and interaction across the ancient world that imply levels of connectivity and communication far greater than the conventional narrative would predict. Linguistic research has suggested that some of the world's major language families are far older than previously thought, implying the existence of large, connected linguistic communities in periods before the accepted beginning of civilization. And archaeological discoveries at sites around the world, including Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the oldest known monumental stone structure at approximately 12,000 years old, have demonstrated that human societies were capable of complex, organized collective action thousands of years before the first cities appeared. Göbekli Tepe is worth pausing on, because it illustrates perfectly the way in which a single discovery can transform our understanding of the human past. Before its excavation, beginning in the 1990s by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, the prevailing view in archaeology was that the construction of large stone monuments required a settled, agricultural society with a surplus of food and labor. Hunter-gatherers, it was assumed, were too mobile, too small-scale, and too preoccupied with survival to undertake the kind of sustained collective effort needed to build a monument like Göbekli Tepe. The site, with its elaborately carved stone pillars arranged in precise circular enclosures, dating to approximately 10 to 12,000 years before the present, demolished this assumption. It demonstrated that the capacity for monumental, organized construction predates agriculture by thousands of years, that the cognitive and social capabilities needed for civilization were present in human populations long before the conventional timeline suggests they were expressed. If Göbekli Tepe exists on dry land, what might exist on the ocean floor? The site was built in a period when sea levels were significantly lower than today, and the coastlines of the world were hundreds of miles further from where they are now. If human societies were capable of building Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago, they were certainly capable of building other structures of comparable ambition in other parts of the world. Some of those other structures, built on coastlines and river deltas that have since been submerged, may be waiting for us on the seafloor. We have not yet found them, but the failure to find something is not proof that it does not exist. It may simply mean that we have not looked hard enough, or in the right place, or with the right tools. This is the essential argument for investing seriously in the archaeological exploration of the ocean floor. Not because we expect to find Atlantis, not because we believe that there was a lost civilization of superhuman capabilities living in the deep ocean before recorded history, but because we know, based on everything we have learned about the post-glacial sea level rise and the distribution of ancient human populations, that significant amounts of archaeological material must exist on the continental shelves and coastal zones that were submerged by the rising ocean. We know that the people who lived on those now drowned coasts were anatomically and cognitively modern, fully capable of the same kinds of cultural achievement as the populations who later built the first cities. And we know that the conventional history of civilization is incomplete, that it describes only the parts of the human story for which physical evidence has survived on dry land, and ignores the vast chapters that are written in sediment beneath the sea. As we approach the end of our journey through the underwater world, it is worth reflecting on what we have learned and what it means for our understanding of the human past and the future of human knowledge. We have traveled from the volcanic islands of the mid-Atlantic to the drowned plains of Southeast Asia, from the harbor of Alexandria to the deep waters of the Caribbean, from the contested terraces of Yonaguni to the anoxic depths of the Black Sea. We have encountered natural formations that look man-made and man-made structures that look natural. We have seen ancient ships preserved with astonishing completeness by the unique chemistry of an unusual sea. We have watched tiny fish create geometric masterpieces on the sandy seafloor. And we have followed the slow, painstaking work of researchers who are using technology and ingenuity to recover the stories that the ocean has been keeping for thousands of years. The overall picture that emerges from this journey is one of extraordinary richness and complexity. The underwater world is not a uniform, featureless void. It is a landscape of enormous variety, shaped by the same forces of geology, biology, and human activity that have shaped the surface world, but preserved in different ways and presenting different challenges to the people who try to understand it. The ocean floor contains evidence of everything from the formation of the planet itself to the activities of human beings just a few centuries ago, and making sense of this evidence requires the full arsenal of modern science, combined with the kind of persistent curiosity and creative thinking that has always been the hallmark of the best researchers. The mysteries we have explored in this documentary are at very different stages of resolution. Some, like the question of the natural or artificial origin of the Yonaguni Monument, are genuinely unresolved, with legitimate arguments on both sides and insufficient evidence to reach a definitive conclusion. Others, like the nature of the underwater structures around the Azores, have been investigated thoroughly enough that a consensus has emerged, even if it has not been universally accepted. And still others, like the significance of the Black Sea shipwrecks or the ecology of Sundaland, are well-established scientific findings that continue to be refined and expanded with each new research program. What all of these mysteries share is their connection to the ocean, the medium that makes them both fascinating and difficult to study. The ocean is simultaneously the world's greatest archive and its most formidable barrier. It preserves things that would have been destroyed long ago on the surface, but it also makes those things extraordinarily difficult to access and study. It holds secrets that have the potential to transform our understanding of the human past, but it guards those secrets behind hundreds or thousands of feet of water, crushing pressure, and eternal darkness. The challenge of the coming decades is to develop the technology, the methods, and the institutional will to overcome these barriers and to access the archive that the ocean contains. The tools are being developed, the methodologies are being refined. The scientific case for the importance of underwater archaeology is being made with increasing urgency and increasing success to the funding agencies and policymakers who control the resources needed for serious exploration. And the public interest in underwater discoveries, in the mysteries of the deep and the secrets of the drowned past, has never been greater. But technology and funding and public interest are not enough on their own. What is also needed, perhaps more than anything else, is the intellectual honesty to approach the evidence of the underwater world with both an open mind and a rigorous skepticism, to resist the temptation to see what we want to see in ambiguous sonar images or grainy underwater photographs, and to insist on the kind of careful, systematic investigation that can distinguish real discoveries from wishful thinking. The history of underwater exploration is littered with claims that turned out to be false, structures that looked artificial and proved to be natural, sites that looked ancient and proved to be recent, and discoveries that looked revolutionary and proved to be mundane. Every false alarm makes the genuine discoveries harder to communicate and harder to take seriously. The antidote to this problem is not less enthusiasm, but more rigor. The excitement of discovery, the thrill of peering into the unknown and catching a glimpse of something that might change everything, is one of the most powerful motivations in science, and it should be nurtured and encouraged. But it must be matched by an equal commitment to the hard, slow, often unglamorous work of actually testing the hypotheses that discovery generates, of following up on initial observations with the kind of systematic, controlled investigation that can determine what a feature really is and what it really means. The greatest discoveries in the history of science have always been the ones that survived this process, the ones that looked extraordinary at first and then looked even more extraordinary as the evidence accumulated and the questions were refined. The Black Sea shipwrecks looked extraordinary when first found, and they have become more extraordinary, not less, as they have been studied in detail. The discovery of the pufferfish mating circles looked extraordinary when first reported, and it became a landmark in the study of animal behavior precisely because the follow-up investigation confirmed and extended the initial findings rather than explaining them away. The best underwater discoveries are the ones that reward rigorous investigation, that hold up under scrutiny and reveal new depths of complexity and significance as they are examined more closely. There is one more dimension of the underwater world that we have not yet fully explored, and it is perhaps the most important of all. It is not a physical sight or a biological phenomenon or a technological achievement. It is a question, the question that underlies everything we have discussed in this documentary, and that will shape the future of underwater exploration for decades to come. The question is this: what is our responsibility to the underwater world? The ocean floor is not just an archaeological site. It is an ecosystem, home to billions of organisms of extraordinary diversity and complexity, many of which have not yet been discovered or named by science. It is a dynamic geological environment, constantly being reshaped by tectonic activity, volcanic eruptions, and the slow but inexorable movement of the Earth's plates. And it is a fragile environment, increasingly threatened by human activities ranging from deep-sea mining and fishing to plastic pollution and climate change, which are altering the chemistry, temperature, and biology of the deep ocean in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The exploration of the underwater world for archaeological and historical purposes must be conducted with a sensitivity to this broader ecological context. Archaeological sites on the seafloor do not exist in isolation. They are embedded in living ecosystems, and the methods used to study them must be designed to minimize disturbance to those ecosystems. The deployment of ROVs and AUVs, the collection of sediment samples, and the excavation of archaeological sites all have the potential to disturb the seafloor and its inhabitants, and these disturbances must be carefully managed. At the same time, the preservation of underwater archaeological sites is itself an environmental issue. The same human activities that threaten deep-sea ecosystems, mining, fishing, dumping, also threaten the archaeological sites that lie on the seafloor. Deep-sea mining operations can obliterate ancient shipwrecks and other archaeological remains in the course of extracting minerals from the seafloor. Bottom trawling, a fishing technique in which weighted nets are dragged across the seabed, destroys both the benthic ecosystem and any archaeological material in its path. And plastic pollution, which is now present even in the deepest parts of the ocean, is introducing chemicals that can accelerate the deterioration of organic materials on the seafloor. The need to protect underwater archaeological sites from these threats is increasingly being recognized by international bodies and national governments, and a growing body of international law addresses the protection of the underwater cultural heritage. The UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, adopted in 2001, establishes international standards for the protection and study of underwater sites and artifacts, emphasizing the importance of in situ preservation, the approach of leaving artifacts in their original location whenever possible, and insisting on the highest standards of scientific rigor in any investigation or excavation that is conducted. But international law, however well-intentioned, is only as effective as the will to enforce it, and the will to protect the underwater world from exploitation and destruction is still very much a work in progress. The deep ocean is, by its nature, beyond the practical reach of most regulatory authorities, and the monitoring and enforcement of regulations in such a vast and inaccessible environment is enormously challenging. The development of effective mechanisms for protecting the underwater cultural and natural heritage is one of the great governance challenges of the 21st century, and it will require sustained international cooperation, significant investment in monitoring and enforcement capacity, and a fundamental shift in the way that societies value the ocean and its contents. This shift is happening, albeit slowly. Public awareness of the importance and fragility of the marine environment has grown enormously in recent decades, driven by the work of marine biologists, oceanographers, documentary filmmakers, and communicators who have brought the beauty and complexity of the underwater world to audiences that would previously have had no connection to it. The same technology that is enabling underwater archaeological exploration, the remotely operated vehicles, the high-resolution cameras, the advanced sonar systems, is also enabling the documentation and communication of underwater natural history in ways that inspire wonder and concern in equal measure. The stories we have told in this documentary of drowned continents and submerged wonders, of ancient ships and geometric stone formations and extraordinary deep-sea creatures, are all part of a larger story about the relationship between humanity and the ocean. We have always depended on the sea for food, for trade, for travel, for inspiration. And the sea has always been the keeper of our history, the repository of the evidence of our past that has been lost to the relentless processes of time. The challenge and the opportunity of the coming decades is to develop the tools, the knowledge, and the wisdom to access that repository, to recover the stories it contains, and to share them with a world that is hungry for a deeper understanding of where we came from and who we are. The ocean does not give up its secrets willingly. Every discovery requires effort, ingenuity, and persistence of a kind that most people will never be called upon to demonstrate. The researchers who dive to the ruins of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, who map the seabed of the Black Sea with remotely operated vehicles, who spend years studying the surfaces of the Yonaguni Monument in search of evidence that will settle a decades-long debate, these are people driven by something more than professional ambition. They are driven by the same impulse that has always powered the best human endeavors, the desire to understand, to know, to pull back the curtain on a mystery that has been frustrating and fascinating in equal measure. And the mysteries are real. Beneath the surface of the ocean, in the cold and the dark and the crushing silence of the deep, there are things waiting to be found that will change the way we understand ourselves. Of this we can be confident because the history of underwater exploration is a history of surprises, of discoveries that no one predicted and that transformed the field the moment they were made. The perfectly preserved ancient Greek merchant ship on the floor of the Black Sea was not predicted. The circular mating formations of the Japanese pufferfish were not predicted. The extraordinary richness of the deep-sea ecosystem was not predicted. And the next major discovery, whatever it turns out to be, whether a submerged city on the continental shelf or a new species in the abyss or a piece of technology that revolutionizes our ability to see the seafloor, will almost certainly not be predicted either. This is what makes the underwater world such a compelling subject for exploration and investigation. It is genuinely unknown. In an era when satellite imagery has mapped every square mile of the Earth's surface, and when it sometimes feels as though there are no more mysteries left to solve on dry land, the ocean floor remains a genuine frontier, a place where the maps are still mostly blank, and where the next expedition might reveal something that rewrites a chapter of human history or transforms our understanding of the natural world. The exploration of this frontier is not the work of a single generation. It will take decades, perhaps centuries, to survey the ocean floor in the kind of detail that will be needed to fully understand what lies beneath the waves. The technology will improve, the methods will be refined, and the discoveries will accumulate. Each generation of researchers will inherit the questions of the previous generation, add new questions of their own, and leave a foundation for the generation that comes after. It is the long, slow, collaborative enterprise that is the true nature of science, played out on the largest and most challenging stage that our planet offers. We began this journey with a question, what lies beneath? After 2 hours of exploration, we have not answered that question, not fully, but we have mapped some of its contours. We have seen what the ocean has already revealed, and we have glimpsed, however dimly, what it might still be holding back. We have met the researchers who are doing the work of discovery, and we have understood something of the challenges they face and the stakes of the endeavor they are engaged in. And we have perhaps developed a slightly deeper appreciation for the extraordinary world that lies beneath the surface of the sea, the world that covers most of our planet, that shaped the course of human history, and that still holds in its cold and silent depths the answers to questions we have not yet thought to ask. The waves break on every shore, the tides rise and fall, and in the darkness beneath the secrets wait. Consider, as we bring this exploration to its close, what we now know. We know that the Azores, while perhaps not the remains of Atlantis, sit at the edge of one of the most geologically active regions on Earth, in waters that have never been fully surveyed for archaeological material, in an area where the history of sea level change and tectonic activity makes the existence of submerged ancient landscapes a genuine possibility. We know that Sundaland, the drowned continent of Southeast Asia, was home to our ancestors for at least 100,000 years, that it was submerged by the post-glacial sea level rise, and that its vast, shallow seafloor has been barely explored by underwater archaeologists. We know that the Pharos of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the ancient world, lies scattered across the floor of Alexandria's harbor, and that cutting-edge technology is being used to virtually reconstruct it for the first time in 5 centuries. We know that sonar images from the depths of the Caribbean show something on the seafloor that does not fit neatly into the category of natural geology, and that those images have never been followed up with the kind of rigorous investigation that would determine their true nature. We know that the Yonaguni Monument near Japan has features that experts have been debating for decades, and that the question of its natural or artificial origin remains genuinely open. We know that the Black Sea has preserved an extraordinary fleet of ancient ships in near-perfect condition, thanks to the unique chemistry of its deep, anoxic waters, and that these ships have given us an unprecedented window into the maritime world of antiquity. We know that deep-sea creatures like the Dumbo octopus and the pufferfish create patterns and structures on the ocean floor that can be mistaken for human artifacts, and that the interpretation of any feature observed on the seafloor requires a deep understanding of both the geological and biological processes that shape the marine environment. We know that the technology for underwater exploration is advancing rapidly, and that the next decade will see surveys of the ocean floor at a scale and resolution that were previously impossible. And we know that the answers to some of the most fundamental questions about the human past may be waiting on the seafloor, preserved in the sediment of drowned coastlines and submerged river valleys, waiting for the technology and the will to find them. The ocean is patient. It has been keeping its secrets for thousands of years, and it is in no hurry to give them up. But we are learning to ask the right questions, to use the right tools, and to look in the right places. And as we do, the darkness is slowly, incrementally, being replaced by light. Not the warm, dancing light of the surface world, but the cold, blue-white beam of an ROV's floodlights sweeping across the seafloor, illuminating for just a moment a fragment of stone or wood or ceramic that has been lying in the dark for centuries or millennia, waiting to tell its story to anyone patient and persistent enough to find it. That light, that slow, painstaking, technologically sophisticated act of illumination, is the real story of underwater exploration. Not the dramatic discovery or the headline-grabbing claim, but the long, difficult, collaborative work of actually figuring out what is down there and what it means. It is a story of science at its best, curious, rigorous, humble in the face of what it does not know, and driven by the conviction that the truth, whatever it turns out to be, is worth the effort of finding it. The shadows are deep, the waters are vast, and the work has only just begun.